are effectively being plundered to support continued growth in the North. This is the cause not only of environmental degradation, but also of mass poverty and human deprivation in the global South. My colleagues and I calculated that the value of the total appropriated resources from the South each year is equivalent to about $10.8 trillion in northern prices, which would be enough to end extreme poverty 70 times over. But instead, the South is maintained in conditions of misery in order to shore up the possibility of continued capitalist growth in the global North. In other words, the dual crisis of ecological breakdown and mass deprivation in the global South is an effect of imperialist appropriation in the world economy. Okay. Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to explain what's going on here, why and how these net flows occur. But first, I want to establish a broader point. I want to argue that imperialist appropriation along these lines is not incidental. It is a structurally necessary feature of capitalist growth. Here's the key thing to understand. Under capitalism, growth is not about increasing production to meet specific human needs. It is about increasing production in order to generate and accumulate surplus value. That is the overriding objective. And this is important because people have a tendency to think of capitalism as simply a system of markets and trade. But of course, markets and trade existed for thousands of years before capitalism. So what makes capitalism distinctive is that it is organized around and dependent on perpetual expansion for the sake of perpetual accumulation. Now, in order to sustain perpetual expansion and accumulation, capital requires an ever-rising quantity of inputs at the lowest possible price. And to achieve this, capital has to find ways of cheapening labor and resources. Now, one option is to sabotage your domestic resource base and your domestic working class by cutting protections on labor and the environment. But of course, this hurts people, and sooner or later, you're likely to face something like a revolution. If you want to avoid this backlash, and indeed if you are under pressure to improve the conditions of your working class, your only other option is to sabotage some third party who is not in a position to fight back. You need some kind of outside where you can exploit resources and labor and externalize social and ecological damages with impunity. And this is where the colonies come in. Capitalism has relied on forms of colonization for the entirety of its 500-year history in order to keep input prices as low as possible. Imperialism is a structurally necessary feature of capitalist growth. This arrangement was obvious, of course, during the colonial period, from the late 1400s onward. Capitalism in Western Europe, we know, relied utterly on the appropriation of resources from the colonies and on the use of enslaved and indentured labor on a truly vast scale. Think of the silver plundered from the Andes, the sugar and cotton grown on land appropriated from indigenous Americans, the grain, the rubber, the gold, countless other resources appropriated from Asia and Africa. This global network of extractive industries enabled the economic rise of the imperialist states and underpinned the Industrial Revolution. Now, this arrangement came under threat in the middle of the 20th century, with the rise of the radical anti-colonial movement across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Newly independent governments refused to be plundered by Northern capital and pursued strategies of economic sovereignty, drawing on socialist principles and reclaiming their resources. And improving welfare. It was a kind of development miracle. But Northern powers were not pleased. As these progressive policies were cutting off their access to cheap labor and resources in the global South, this became a problem for them, as they had relied on this kind of appropriation during the colonial period. In other words, it caused the colonial arrangement to unravel, and this triggered a massive crisis of capitalism in the 1970s, which manifests as stagflation. This is not surprising. After all, any significant increase in the price of Southern wages, resources, and goods, and any increase in the South's share of global consumption will be inherently inflationary for the North and will constrain the North's growth. The unraveling of the colonial arrangement made capital accumulation in the global North very difficult to sustain, especially given that wages were also rising in the North at the same time, thanks to the power of organized labor. So capitalism faced a crisis in the 1970s because it cannot function under conditions of global justice. Okay? Now, so the imperialist states were scrambling for a way to respond, and they did so first by intervening militarily to depose anti-colonial leaders. The list is long and includes several figures that all of us should know. Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, deposed in 1953 by a Western-backed coup. Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, deposed in 1961 by a Western-backed coup. Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, deposed in 1954 by a Western-backed coup. Sukarno in Indonesia, deposed in 1967 by a Western-backed coup. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, deposed in 1966 by a Western-backed coup. Salvador Allende in Chile, the one we all know, deposed in 1973 by a Western-backed coup. Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, deposed in 1987 by a Western-backed coup, and many others who were unseated and replaced with right-wing dictators, more amenable to Western economic interests, and who rolled back the socialist and anti-colonial reforms of the progressive era. But northern states also intervened by using the World Bank and the IMF to impose structural adjustment programs across the global south in the 1980s and 1990s. Structural adjustment forced governments to cut tariffs and subsidies, cut protections on labor and the environment, cut public spending, and cut public sector employment. This was the sharp edge of neoliberal reform, imposed more viciously on the global south than ever it was in the USA or Britain. And the effect was to destroy the South's economic sovereignty and push the prices of labor and resources back down. Structural adjustment thus restored the imperial arrangement and rescued capitalism in the global north. It restored the rate of corporate profit, and it restored the northern rate of growth. There's an important point to be made here. Progressives quite often like to think of neoliberalism as the disease, and they yearn to return to the less rapacious version of capitalism that preceded it. But neoliberalism is not the disease. It is a symptom of the disease. The disease is capitalism. Neoliberalism was imposed because it was necessary to keep capital accumulation afloat in the face of a resurgent South. It was imposed in response to global justice. At the end of the 1970s, the governments of the global North faced a fork in the road. They could either accept a socialist and anti-imperialist South and decent wages at home, and therefore abandon capital accumulation, shifting to a post-capitalist economy, or they could try to maintain capital accumulation by doing something drastic to restore the basic structure of the imperial arrangements. They chose the latter, and structural adjustment was their mechanism. Now, by undermining the South's attempts to achieve economic sovereignty, structural adjustment put Southern economies back in a position of being dependent on exports to and imports from the global North. But because they also depressed prices in the South, this means that for every unit of embodied resources and labor that they import, they have to export many more units to pay for it. And this is what we refer to as unequal exchange, and it generates the large net flows of resources from south to north that I described earlier. So this image here shows the unequal exchange of labor between the global south and the global north. The light gray bars on the top show the scale of southern imports in the north, while the dark gray bars at the bottom show the scale of southern exports to the north. For every unit of embodied labor that the south imports from the north, they have to export on average 13 units to pay for it. This reflects truly massive wage inequalities in the world economy. Under capitalism, southern labor is worth 1/13 that of northern labor, not because they are less productive or because they produce less value. In fact, the opposite is true. Southern workers produce more units per hour than northern workers because they're compelled to work under extremely intense labor regimes. They receive lower wages not because they are somehow naturally cheap, but because they have been cheapened. And this cheapening means that the core economies benefit from an enormous quantity of additional labor, well beyond what their own populations could provide. The same is true for embodied raw materials, which we can see here. For every unit the South imports from the North, they have to export 5 units to pay for it. The same is true for embodied lands, where again the ratio is 5 to 1. And the same is true for embodied energy, where the ratio is 3 to 1. So this is the form that imperialism takes in the 21st century. It is an arrangement that enables imperial appropriation without the need, in most cases, for military occupation. Now, the question becomes, how could the World Bank and the IMF get away with imposing policies that were so clearly destructive to the global South? And the answer to this question is that these institutions are deeply undemocratic. There's a tendency in progressive circles to believe that the World Bank and the IMF were founded as progressive institutions back in the 1940s. But in fact, they are colonial institutions, founded during colonialism and with colonial principles in mind. The global South countries at the time were integrated into these institutions on purposefully unequal terms, and they remain fundamentally unequal to this day. So the United States has veto power over all major decisions, and together with the rest of the G7, controls more than half of the votes in the World Bank and the IMF. The global South, which has the vast majority of the world's population, has only about 1/3 of the vote. If this was the case in any national parliament, we would all be outraged. We would call it apartheid. And yet apartheid principles operate right at the center of our global economic governance system. The core economies are able to determine the rules of international trade and finance in their own interests. And the imposition of structural adjustment on the global South, with all of its consequences, was simply an outcome of this privilege. So the GDP of southern countries is not low because they produce little value. It is because their labor, their lands, and their lives are cheapened. This happens through structural adjustment, but that's not the only mechanism for cheapening. It also happens through the exercise of monopsony power in global commodity chains. Lead firms like Apple are so dominant in their sectors that they can basically dictate prices to their suppliers in the global South, forcing them to keep wages at or even below subsistence. It also happens through monopoly power. More than 90% of all patents are owned by northern firms. So not only do they set prices for their suppliers, they can also set the prices of final sale. And of course, the difference between the prices they pay for their suppliers versus the prices they get at the till is registered as GDP in the global North. This allows lead firms to appropriate value that is produced in the global South, a pattern that is cemented by the patent rules enshrined in the World Trade Organization. Speaking of which, I should mention here briefly, finally, that the WTO is also fundamentally anti-democratic. Bargaining power in the WTO is determined by market size. So the countries that became rich during the colonial period are able to determine the rules of trade in their own interests. So in this sense, in the WTO, inequality begets inequality. So with the data on imperialist appropriation in mind, we can return to the question of global inequality. When neoclassical economists think about global inequality, they assume that all the world's countries are on the same general trajectory of development. They're just at different stages. The poorer countries of the global South are simply behind. They will be able to follow the same development trajectory as the US and Europe and eventually catch up to them. But once we understand that capitalist growth in the global North depends on patterns of imperialist appropriation, this narrative is revealed to be absurd. Catch-up development cannot occur within a system that is predicated on imperialist appropriation. It physically cannot occur in the context of net south-north flows, and it cannot occur within a system that relies on cheapening southern labor and resources. Saying that poor countries can catch up to rich ones in this context makes about as much sense as saying that Amazon workers can catch up with Jeff Bezos if they just work hard enough. These are not two different trajectories. They are two poles of a distribution within a single economic system. The income gap between the South and the North has continued to widen since the end of colonialism. There's no catch-up development happening. This is not because poor countries are behind. It is because they are exploited. This also allows us to have a different perspective on global poverty. Poverty in the global South, contrary to dominant narratives, is not some kind of natural condition. It is an effect of imperialist appropriation of southern resources and labor and productive capacity. It is an effect of price depression, which constrains southern income and purchasing power and consumption. And it is an effect of the rules of international trade and finance that preclude the South from using sensible policies that would enable them to achieve sovereign development, such as the policies used during the 60s. And indeed, this is why we see that development success stories are only really ever achieved to the extent that countries somehow manage to claw back some degree of economic sovereignty and use state-led industrial policy, which of course we can see in the case of China, some of the South American countries, and for different geopolitical reasons, the East Asian tigers. Okay. But there's another reason to question catch-up narratives, and it has to do with ecology. Here's the key point. The high levels of resource use and energy use that characterize the core economies cannot be universalized. They cannot be universalized because they rely on net appropriation, but also because they are wildly in excess of sustainable boundaries. If all countries were to use resources at the rate of the core economies, we would need 4 Earths to sustain us. If all countries were to use energy at the rate of the core economies, decarbonization in line with the Paris Agreement would be literally impossible. Indeed, we would be cruising for
There we go. You're muted, Pat.
Still got the lo-fi ripping. Do you want to keep that on or no?
Oh, shit. All right, you ready?
Yeah. You still got the lo-fi on. Do you want that on or no?
Yeah, fuck it, leave it on.
Can you turn it down just a little bit?
Yeah. You know what? Let's throw this shit on. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to episode 2 of Subversive History, where we're going to be talking about The Divide by Jason Hickel. Not Jackson Hinkle. Completely different guy. Definitely not a LaRoucheite, not a piece of shit. And definitely not some, some weird off-brand fucking grift.
I think this is episode 3, actually.
Officially.
Well, I think this is officially episode 3, but we had an episode 0, and then we had Inventing Reality, then we had our previous one on The Divide, and now this would be the 3rd.
Right. Yeah. What did I say?
You said this was our 2nd episode.
Whatever. 2nd episode on The Divide.
That is true.
Episode 2 on The Divide by Jason Hickel. So this episode, right, we're going to go over part 2 concerning violence, and we start off with chapters 3 of Where Did Poverty Come From? The creation story, which opens up with the quote, "No one colonizes innocently" by Amy Césaire.
For those that don't know, among the great authors on colonialism, Amy Césaire is amongst the great. Small, easy read, but it's very poetic in nature. Should be held up there along your Fanons and your other great anti-colonial authors. We actually forgot to mention. I don't know if you even realized this, but did you see in the beginning what the very first thing in The Divide is? The first little message in it.
The first middle message.
No, the first little message. So look, here's like the beginning, The Divide. Did you notice this?
Oh, he dedicated it to who? Frantz Fanon, right? To the wretched of the earth. Yeah. Yeah,
just with no other context, it just says "for the wretched of the earth," which I thought was pretty great.
For those in the know.
Mm-hmm. For the real ones.
For the real ones. So let's see here. I mean, he starts off chapter 3 where he did the very beginning of the book where he starts talking about the world at the time of 1500, where Africa, Asia, and Europe are pretty much all on the same footing.
And in many respects, that China and India are actually more developed in many respects than the European continent. Just a couple metrics that I put together here. There was a little difference between Europe and the global South. South America, China, India were actually better off in many ways. Life expectancy in England was about 32 to 34 in the year 1500, and only about 15 years old for children that were born to working class families, meaning the children that were routinely sent to work in extremely dangerous factories and other hazardous working conditions. Conversely, or alternatively, forage farming communities enjoyed a roughly 50% higher life expectancy. They were healthier, stronger, taller, better nourished, and less likely to die from famine. Evidence from China and Japan that up until 1800, they had an advantage over Europe. Japanese life expectancy was between 41 and 45. China was 35 to 40. Asians could expect to live about 10% longer than Europeans. In terms of some specific metrics of development, Asia had better transport tech, sanitation, public health, and nutritional standards. And in the year 1500, Europe accounted for about 15%. The entire continent accounted for about 15% of GDP, while China and India together accounted for 65%.
Yeah, I also love the little dig that he gave that like Europe in 1500, just emerging from the Dark Ages, was a little more than a backwater. Because like, I don't know, I've had this conversation like multiple times now, and I'm sure I'm not the only like leftist streamer that's like brought this up. But when you actually like look at a map, like a world map, right? Africa makes sense as a continent. North America, South America makes sense as a continent. Two very large land masses, even if they are connected by a very tiny little land bridge, right? Australia makes sense. Antarctica used to make sense. All the continents except for Europe does not make sense as a continent. It's such like a blurry little like dividing line that they try to make between like what's Europe and what's Asia. You know what I mean? It's technically just like a peninsula of Asia.
Yeah, and from what I hear, there's like a lot of like contention with like even places like Turkey and stuff like that. That like maybe the more I don't know if I want to say the more conservative elements of that country, like they kind of like desperately want to be European. They want to be more part of Europe than they do Asia, and it's kind of like a competition to become more European.
Like why would you want that? Why would you want like especially with the way Europe is going right now? Why would you want to be more European?
I don't know.
Like isn't like the euro like just in free fall right now?
Is that different than a lot of currencies? I would say. I would say yeah. What is like the dominant currency at the moment?
Dominant. Let's see. It's still the U.S. dollar.
Yeah, which is also
U.S. dollar is the world's dominant reserve currency among other such currencies, including the euro, the yen, the pound, the renminbi, and the Canadian dollar, the Swiss franc, the Australian dollar.
Right. This is I don't know how many people. We only have 3 people watching right now, but for those of you that were here, if it's any of our dedicated listeners in our nascent stream, if you recall, in the last hour of our previous stream, we had a little bit of a contentious dialogue with a certain chatter named Shashank. And oh wow, there's 7 people in here now. Okay, if anybody recalls the contentious little debate that we had at the end with our friend Shashank, it's very coincidental that we had an argument relating to the alleged positive influence that Britain may have had over India, maybe some like altruistic intentions that they may have had in their colonial process, which certainly contradicts our friend Amy Cesar, as they said in the beginning here, that no one colonizes innocently, which I would agree with. But if only we had read maybe 5, 10, 20 more pages of the book that we're currently reviewing, we would have had an enormous amount of evidence to the contrary, more than we already had just off the top of our heads. So while this is going to be a review of the third chapter of the book, The Divide, I think there should be a subtitle of this episode called The Shawshank Redemption. I will be countering some of those more spurious claims made by our friend Chad. I don't know if he's going to be in chat or they are going to be in chat today.
I just checked. He's not here yet.
Oh, okay. Because that would be fun. Because this chapter really eviscerates any argument that they may have been levying in the chat in that last hour. So very excited to go over that. Not only because I think it's incredibly entertaining and engaging content, but also because I'm petty and I want to further. I have not let that go. That someone came in chat and started to disagree with us. So
Pat will debate you in the marketplace of ideas, but also like physical hand-to-hand combat.
Come on.
You won't deny it.
So getting back into the so the reason I like this chapter so much is because obviously you had the preface, with the preface referring mostly kind of like to the origin story of Jason and kind of his backstory and what motivated him to get into this kind of like anthropological economic pursuit of figuring out why poverty exists, why this divide exists between poor countries and rich countries. Then you kind of have the first and second chapter that kind of broadly covers like, what is this concept of poverty? How is it measured? What is the historical implications and portrayals of poverty, and how can they be manipulated? How can they be fabricated? How can they be used to political ends? Now this chapter, which is so entertaining, and the reason, we're finally getting to our like historical aims here of this stream, is the history of poverty. Like, has there just always been poverty? Has everyone just kind of started at this natural state of poverty, and then did someone in Britain figure something out that ascended them into opulence while everyone else just, dug around in the dirt in their primitive, uncivilized paths?
Yeah, it's like that human nature argument that like, this is just the way things are. This is just the nature of things.
Exactly. And I think that just in this chapter, we're only covering about 40 pages of this book today, and there is so much content and so much relevant information that creates a very clean, linear series of events that really led us to the world system that we are currently existing in. And kind of like we were referring to a little bit earlier, we're going to start our analysis of this around the year 1500, because in a very confusing turn of events in the year 1500, through the statistics that we rattled off a little bit earlier, England and Europe were not doing much better off than anywhere else. Europe was not in the seat of civilization, driving, technological, economic, living standards, or any of these metrics that we measure civilization with. We can look at places like China and India, as well as places in South America, as being much more advanced and much more stable in these respects than England or any other European nation at that time. So that raises the question: what happened? What caused something that was roughly at parity? Roughly, I would say that even these other empires that we were discussing, such as in India and in China, were actually very much more advanced in many respects. So what caused such a massive change in that level of development? And that's what Jason Hickel is going to be breaking down here, and that's what we're going to disseminate through our reading to this stream. Before we start going into those specific events and how and why and what the effects were, Johnny, do you have anything else that you want to add to this kind of introduction?
Yeah. So I'm of the thought that ever since I first heard it described to me by this person, Shaquille McLean, he runs the website decolonizeallthethings.com, right? Where he talks about how it's very much of like the liberal mindset to have things just pop up out of nowhere, right? But there is a site, like a site for every kind of phenomena, like especially, you know, ones that built out of social constructs or constructs like such as colonization or racism, or like, you know, this whole idea behind like human nature and especially of like historical events, right? It's very anti-materialist to believe that things are just happening totally at random, disconnected from like the site of foundation for these historical events to happen. That's why I love works like this that are based on like, you know, a materialist understanding. Right. Jason Hickel comes at you with statistics. He comes at you with sources cited. He comes at you not with opinions, but with like things that you can actually look into, books, you know, to be recommended to further read up, like, you know, on specific topics that we talk about. Right. And not just like, you know, well, that's just, you know, how things are. Like, you know, our viewer, you know, Shawshank was talking about last episode, where it's just like, well, you know, without the English, India wouldn't have been mechanized, and mechanization is how, you know, things get industrialized, and that's how things get better, you know. And that right there, right, is a social construct. And you know, we'll talk a little bit later on about like the term improvement and how it was used, you know, during the era of the rise of the merchant, the rise of the capitalist class in England. But you want to take us away, Pat?
Sure. Yeah, and I agree with everything that you're saying there. The wealth of information in this book is staggering. And the first time I read it, it was just enjoyable. I just sat there and I just leafed through it, and I just you know, retained what I could, and you know, didn't what I didn't, and just enjoyed myself. The amount of relevant information in this book makes it very difficult to read it with the intention in mind to present it later in a stream, because it seems that every sentence is just so, every paragraph is so jam-packed with relevant content that every single paragraph I'm taking notes and being like, this is so important, this is so important, this is so important. So I'm going to do my best to be able to translate some of that in layman's terms to the chat and to the stream, but you know, bear with us, because this is you just have to get the book for yourself. I couldn't recommend it. And if anyone, you know, is looking to get educated on economics from like a leftist perspective, I think this is like, you know, 101 that I would recommend. So with all that being said, the chapter really starts off in 1492, which I think that many historically literate individuals would recognize as the year that Christopher Columbus happened upon.
He didn't sail fucking anywhere.
Happened upon is what we. Oh, by the way, hey, what's up, Sam? Good to see you in the chat. Happened upon Hispaniola, or what would be today known as the areas of Haiti, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic.
I think one important thing that like I think I learned through like what's his name on like the East is a podcast. I didn't realize this until very recently, that like the Moors, you know, of Spain, right? Guess what year they were kicked out of Spain or driven out of Spain?
I'm gonna go 1492.
1490 or like 1491. Sina Romani. Thank you, Sam. Yes. He's amazing. I hope one day we can, you know, convince him to come on. But yeah, like that was like an amazing like revelation in my mind that like the Moors, you know, were driven out of Spain, or the what is it, the Iberian Peninsula, like the year beforehand. It's wild.
Well, and I mean, this is not going to be necessarily, this isn't covered in detail, so I really don't want to speak too much out of turn about Christopher Columbus and his situation in Hispaniola. There's a great book called The Other Slavery that really covers, I have a copy of it downstairs. I wish I would have brought it up here so that I could hold it up to the camera and flex it like I do with all my other books that I bring that are relevant to the stream. I forgot that one.
Just underneath the camera.
And also, okay, it's by someone named Andres Resendez, it appears. So definitely check that book out if you want to learn about the more nefarious intentions of Mr. Columbus as he discovered the New World and then went on to abuse pillage, and enslave, and actually initiate the transatlantic slave trade. A lot of people, especially in like contemporary history classes, believe that the transatlantic slave trade began strictly when slaves were being taken from Africa and being brought to the New World. That is actually not correct. The transatlantic slave trade actually was begun by Christopher Columbus, bringing indigenous individuals from those islands I mentioned previously back to Spain to enslave them. So in this process, Christopher Columbus becomes very, very, very motivated to enslave these people. He mentions it numerous times throughout his diaries at that point. He is incessant about it with Spanish royalty, that like just resounding that these people can be slaves. We can enslave these people. We need like 50 dudes and we could enslave this entire island. And then as everyone, this is very common knowledge at this point, whether it be disease, whether it be genocide, whether it be warfare, whether it be starvation, whether it be enslavement, there was a drastic destruction of the population of these islands. Cuba, for example, Cuba has no indigenous population. There is no indigenous Cuban.
There's like allegedly like a very small population left in
From
Cuba.
what I read, it was completely eradicated. I could be wrong though. I'm open to being wrong on that, and I'm bringing this back to a documentary that I watched on Cuba. There just isn't any. The only thing that exists in Cuba is Afro-Cuban slave descendants and European descendants, and a mixture of the two things. I understand that there might be something that's a very small percentage of what was there before, but regardless. So we have the New World discovery, we have the enslavement, we have the genocide, we have the exploitation, and more on the exploitation. We notice that, or Christopher Columbus notices that a lot of these individuals are wearing golden trinkets around, and he is very aware that gold is extremely valuable back in Europe. So this is kind of what initiates this process of exploitation, enslavement, genocide, etc. So
Pat,
obviously,
why is gold and silver important?
Oh, okay, yeah. So gold and silver are incredibly important to Europe because most of the ragtag bullshit that they produce isn't really needed in the other relevant players of world economy. So you have China. Did you read? Okay, maybe you didn't get here. So to illustrate why they needed silver and gold extracted from the New World was because the things that were being produced in Britain and other European nations weren't necessarily desired by places like India and China, which dominated the world economy and the trading routes at that time. So if you could only bring whatever bullshit that you were making in your country, and China and India didn't want it, then you're not getting the spices, you're not getting the linens, you're not getting the porcelain, you're not getting the silk, you're not getting the opium, you're not getting all these relevant things that are super motivating in world trade. So just to illustrate that, I actually have a letter here written to King George. And I apologize, I'm not very knowledgeable on how to pronounce Chinese emperors' names of this time. But Emperor Qianlong to King George III. Until now, all Europeans, including your own country's barbarian merchants, have traded with our Celestian Empire at Guangzhou only. This has been the way for many years, even though our Celestian Empire has all things in tremendous abundance. Okay. Our celestial empire has all things in tremendous abundance and produces all it needs or wants within its own borders. We therefore had no need to import the goods manufactured by outside barbarians in trade for our own products. But we realized that tea, silk, and porcelain that our celestial empire produces are necessities that European nations cannot do without. So we have permitted you, as a notable mark of favor, to trade with our licensed merchant guilds. In this way, your desires for our products should be met, and your country could thus participate in our goodness. Our dynasty, ruling over the many and varied races of the world, extends the same kindness to all. So this is like
he's being so benevolent, like
this is
we
like
don't
an
need your
absolute diss
rags.
track. This is like one of the hardest diss tracks of all time that I've ever heard. Wait, hold on. I didn't even finish. Hold on. I didn't even finish. I do not forget that your island is lonely and remote, cut off from the world by wide wastes of sea, nor do I fail to note your excusable ignorance about the customs of our celestial empire. I have therefore commanded my ministers to enlighten your ambassador about this matter.
It's like, hey, please leave those dish rags, that dirty ass shit that you keep trying to hawk. Just leave it. Leave it at the island. Come with gold. Come with silver. But don't try to bring any of that like shitty food that like you can't taste, right? Tastes like mud. Don't try bringing any of that other crap. You can bring gold and silver. That's it. Leave the rags at home. Like, yeah literally. Thank you, Frank.
An absolute ether disc track at England from China. Pretty much just being like, we don't need any of your bullshit. We have a lot of stuff that you need. Out of the kindness of our hearts, we'll allow some amount of training because we know you need this. And, you know, it would be a effort in altruism or egalitarianism for us to be able to make sure that you get this in the dismal backwater that is Western Europe. Nice. Okay, cool. Well, I'm glad we're tracking at this point. So this brings us back to silver, gold and silver. England, through the acquisition of gold and silver from the New World, finally had something relevant to the global trade market. This is something that that China and India actually desired, was gold and silver. So boom, you have England or Europe, more broadly speaking, Europe, obtaining finally a relevant resource that they don't have very much of an abundance of. Moving forward, let's get back to my stats here. Okay, so this section of the book is called The Making of the World System, and it refers to this dynamic specifically. So as many of us are aware of already, 1492, you start seeing Spain, you start seeing Spain dominate just more and more of Latin America, from Mexico further south to the, what was the Mayan areas that the area of the Mayans, which was like Chiapas, southern Mexico, as well as Guatemala, and some of the neighboring areas, but not all of them. I'm sorry, I'm a little shaky on all of the borders of the Mayan Empire. And then gradually moving down to the Incan Empire. And this is when I believe it was, I'm sorry, I forget the exact span. I don't believe it was Cortez. I believe it was someone else. Made the extremely fraudulent or the nefarious deals with Atahualpa, who was the Incan emperor at the time, who, offered much gold and much silver to the Spanish conquistadors, and was publicly executed and had all their gold and silver reserves taken from them. So just to illustrate that a little bit further, Bolivian, in what is today Bolivia, the silver extraction as well as gold pilfering from Peru, Mexico, and the other areas between 1503 and 1660, there were 16 million kilograms of silver shipped to Europe. And that is 3 times the entire European reserve of gold or silver. And as Jason Hickel says, this was a massive infusion of windfall wealth into the European economy. Now, I looked up what the definition of windfall was, because obviously we can kind of take contextually what it's being used for, but just so that everyone knows what I mean when I say windfall, a windfall refers to an apple or other fruit blown down from a tree or a bush by wind. So like something that is just like a gift, essentially, something that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And so a piece of unexpected good fortune, typically one that involves receiving a large amount of money, is the further definition there. So this massive influx of plundered South American precious metals furnished European militaries, but also, more importantly, it served as a valuable trade commodity for Europeans to use with China and India. Most resources and products from Europe were not needed by the East until silver. This enabled European nations to expand their economies past natural capacity and then allocate agricultural labor into capital-intensive industrial activities.
Not a gunpoint at all.
Yeah. So now you see, what Europe, or any specific any specific European nation, up until this time, you have a relatively domestic concept of an economy. Your nation has the ability to produce, sell, and capitalize on what it can acquire within its borders. Now we are seeing a place like England, which is very small, probably not the best climate for a lot of things, doesn't have the spices, doesn't have the porcelain, doesn't have the thing like that.
It's rainy, it's isolated.
Well, and Spain, obviously referring to Spain more so when we're talking about. But the reason that that's relevant, though, and I apologize,
like mostly mountains, isn't it?
I apologize that I didn't mention this. Spain utilized silver and gold taken from the New World to pay off debts. So that's how it really got proliferated all throughout Europe, especially to England, because as Spain had all these debts, then it started extracting massive amounts of silver and gold. Then now other European nations, which they were indebted to, can now also have reserve of gold and silver that is much greater than they naturally would have access to. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to go on that it wasn't even just like an economic windfall, but he also describes an ecological windfall, a transfusion of resources that allowed Europe to grow its economy beyond its natural limits at the time, to the point of catching up and surpassing China and India around 1800. That's a long time, from like 1492 to 1800. But the point is that, like, you know, China and India then provided a kind of ecological relief to an overstrained Europe. Outsourcing land-intensive production also allowed Europe to reallocate its labor into capital-intensive industrial activities like textile mills, which other states did not have the luxury of doing. So while China and India were predominantly relying on like domestic labor in order to have these spices, silks, and other materials for trade, right? You see Spain and England being able to kind of outsource this like very labor intensive capital accumulation.
Sure. And I don't want to get too far ahead yet, because we're going to come up to the conclusions of all of this. But so this is the first aspect, is the aspect of colonization and precious metal extraction. The second that combines with that is slavery. Because now we're going to have like this two-pronged situation between resource extraction, colonization, and slavery, which kind of came to like a confluence that really like acted as a propellant of European economy past what was domestically available to them.
And it took bodies.
We're going to talk about bodies. Unfortunately, we're going to have to cover a lot of bodies. So the transatlantic slave began shortly after Columbus arrived in Hispaniola. I already discussed that pretty extensively. And then further, the second tier of the transatlantic slave trade was initiated by Spain and Portugal, obtaining prisoners of war from Western Africa. This was like stuff like the Salafate Empire, I believe, or the Caliphate. Yeah, the Caliphate. Yeah. Where there was a lot of like warring going on in Africa, much like in other places of the world, which was producing slaves, which were in turn sold to Portugal. There's actually a lot of information regarding this. I know that there's like a very commonly air breather style kind of response to slavery that like, oh, but Africans were enslaving themselves. You can actually find a wealth of examples of African protests against slavery that were against the slaver nations of Africa, as well as even kings that were at one point sympathetic and benefiting from slavery, being like, we need to stop this because it's destroying, not only is it destroying around us, but now it's negatively affecting us as well. And Portuguese soldiers going in there and being like, it ain't stopping. We're not, like in Breaking Bad, when like, we're not done till I say we're
We're not done till I say we're done.
Right. If this was a different stream and I had more preparations, I would get a little bit of evidence for that. I'm sorry, but I if you need more evidence on that, just reach out in Discord or Twitter or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'll provide
it's up on Discord or Twitter.
Yeah. Moving forward, so the slaves that were being taken from Western Africa would primarily be transferred to European plantations in the Caribbean or Brazilian precious metal mines. So this is why you see kind of less of the domestic slavery happening in Europe itself, and more so slaves being extracted to the New World. During the 1700s, Brazilian mines mined by African slaves produced more gold using slave labor than the total volume Spain had extracted from all its colonies in the previous centuries. So now we're up to the 1700s. As I had said, I went through the millions and millions and millions and millions of kilograms of silver and gold that was extracted by Spain. In the 1700s, within 1 century versus 2 centuries, slave mined gold from Portuguese colonized Brazil accounted for even more gold than the previous 2 centuries combined. So, and also it's very relevant to mention that between 12 and 15 million enslaved Africans died during this period of slavery that existed during the transatlantic slave. And then even just 1.2 to 2.4 billion died just in transit alone before they even reached the New World. So now, just in the United States, this process of slavery netted 222,505,049 forced labor hours between the year 1619 and 1865. That would be worth $97 trillion if we accounted it at minimum wage today. So obviously we can do the ones and twos and the monetary advantages of slavery and colonization, but kind of what you were alluding to previously, that the biggest advantages of having this grotesque, yes, this is live.
Yes. Yes, KJ.
This grotesque method of colonization, resource exploitation, and slavery. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it very well is. A lot of the times he does use conservative estimates. So
which can be the best way to drive a point home if you are expecting critique, because it's like, you're not overblowing it or anyway. If you use even the most conservative estimate, then it's still grotesquely significant. It really drives the point home.
No, they were enslaved indigenous people and African slaves, KJ 9797. And I think it's also important to note that by the middle of the 1600s, because I know that you skipped to like the 1700s, by the middle of the 1600s, the continent, right, of like South America, right, which had like a combined population of like 50 to 100 million, had literally had 95% of its population killed by like 3 million people.
Yeah, absolutely decimated. Absolutely decimated population of Central and South America. Also, not even including the what happened in present day North America. So this is the real crux of this whole situation of what this combination of colonization, resource extraction, and slavery actually accumulated to, other than just the dollars, the nickels, and the dollars and cents of the situation. So, sugarcane produced on colonized land by enslaved bodies accounted for 22% of British calories. So now you have a country which is receiving almost a quarter of its calories from agriculture that is not even occurring within its own borders. That means that its own land is not being utilized for this, and its own labor pool is not being utilized for this. This reduced the need for domestic agriculture and freed up labor that would have otherwise be accounted for with agricultural labor for industrial development. So I don't know, just back on our Shawshank Redemption arc, I don't know if you remember, but they frequently kept saying that it was because of a labor shortage. It was because of a labor shortage. Well, no, they didn't have a labor shortage. They actually had a labor surplus because they were able to export their agricultural needs to the New World and use slaves, which freed up two very important resources, which is land and labor, which could then be dedicated to industrial needs, whereas other countries that didn't have the benefit of colonies and slaves had to only use their own land for agriculture and their own labor force to cultivate that agriculture.
I think it's made even worse by the fact that it's not even just that like their population is slowly being sapped away from them or murdered, but like at the same time the act of colonization is about forced dispossession. Than having the social and economic systems of these various cultures that are being colonized and having that also dismantled. So any kind of alternative social way of interacting with one another needs to be dismantled. Any kind of alternative form of trade, any kind of alternative to what the colonizer is enforcing, right, is to be dismantled and destroyed.
Okay, so just to continue on from there. So, and then also cotton, famous economist Milton Friedman said it was in a vision. Yeah. Cotton produced on colonized land by enslaved bodies provided a key raw material for Europe's Industrial Revolution. Without diverting from food production or straining European land or labor supplies, you can see that now we have the resources which furnished the Industrial Revolution, also not requiring European land or European labor. So not only are they receiving massive amounts of food and also massive amounts of other resources that are conducive to industrialization, they're able to do this completely without any kind of task to their own labor. Or I know I'm being redundant on this, but I think it's so important to understand that this is where we see that exponential takeoff in a place like England, which in prior centuries had no real resource advantage or even really like a technological advantage of any kind. So now if we make a total of this, if we look at timber, sugar, and cotton, the New World accounted for 25 to 30 million ghost acres just to the nation of Britain alone. So this concept of a ghost acre means that the nation of Britain does not have these 25 to 30 million acres within it. I don't even know how big England is. Like, what is the square?
How many acres is England?
I'm just curious, real quick, to see if I can. I'm sorry. What size is the UK in acres? 60 million acres. Okay. Yeah, 60 million acres. So about 50% of the entire English landmass was being provided in resources extracted from the New World. So that is 50% of the entirety of the United Kingdom, which, ask Chile after Salvador Allende how great Milton Friedman's fucking ideas worked out. So that's all I'm going to respond.
His ideas were so popular.
That's all we have to say. That's all we have to say.
His ideas worked out so good they had to reverse them. I think
I think that is the most critical fact in this whole thing, is that we can look at resource extraction and how that individual nation was able to essentially, in a theoretical way, expand its land and labor force by millions and millions and millions and millions of, many orders of magnitude that other nations were unable to obtain. Were you going to say something? I'm sorry. I just wanted to finish that.
No, you're good. I was just going to say that, like, not to jump too further ahead to where we're going to go in the chapter, but
because we have we have a linear. Yeah.
Yeah, we're following the book today pretty hard. But the fact is that they had to have ghost acres, right? Because most of the land was already, it's not even like there was a lack of land or there was something preventing them from using majority of the land that they already had on the tiny island, right? Because they had already privatized pretty much the majority, right, of the land in the UK. If it wasn't owned by the monarchy, it was owned by the landlords or some kind of feudal fiefdom. So it's shocking that you would think that is there something preventing them from being able to use their own land? No.
So now let's talk about the negative effect. And I don't mean negative, it means in terms of the way that it was harmful. I mean that obviously I think a lot of people can understand the positive benefit of extracting resources and using slave labor that is outside of your own labor pool. But negatively, also, what Europe did at this point was essentially force Latin America and other colonies into a captive market status. So it's a two-way street of industrial development and also capitalist development. Correct. Yeah, that's right, Sam. But so like I was saying, capitalism requires markets. You can't just produce with nowhere to sell or nowhere to acquire. So this is something that also benefited Europe at this time. When you have these Latin American, South American nations subjugated in the way that they do, not only are you able to take resources out, raw materials out at massive discounts, but then you're able to import manufactured goods, thus creating the necessity of capitalism. So you're going to see this much more. We're going to go over this a little bit later because you're going to start seeing the ravenous desire for European nations to open markets. Gunboat diplomacy with places like Japan and Korea and China. Wars started over markets opening, not so that they can even colonize it formally or like go in and steal resources, because they need markets, because they're developing some kind of a surplus of resources that needs to be bought.
I just wanted to answer this one comment, whereas the global south can harvest several times in a year in some cases. It's not even just so much that England has like a climate that they're unable to farm. Obviously prior to like the rise of capitalism, or prior to this form of trade with India and Asia, they were able to subsist. They did have means to subsist even during those colder months, even during those winters, right? It's the enclosure, right, of the commons, right, where people were no longer just relying off of the land and having a dynamic environment, right, to be able to farm that land. That land was pretty much kind of like what we see today with monocropping, right? It was about maximization of profit rather than actually being able to subsist off the land or create something that is sustainable to be feeding off of during those colder winter months. So I get what you're going at, and there is a little bit of a difference between the agricultural methods between the global south and what was practiced in England, but it's not to a degree where it's just people are starving any more than they are during the hot summer months in a lot of these countries in the global south at that time.
Right. So, and we'll get definitely more to that momentarily, but I do want to read a quick paragraph of our old friend Marx. There was a very pertinent Marx quote in here regarding this situation, and Marx was conscious of this at his time during his writings. This is under the title of The Great Dispossession. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of blackskins, signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. On their heels tread the commercial war of the European nations with the globe for a theater. If money, according to Auger, comes into the world with a congenital bloodstain on one cheek, capital comes dripping from head to foot from every pore with blood and dirt. So this is Marx's extremely astute assessment of world economic dynamics at that time. I'm sorry, I don't have the year when this was written, but maybe about a century or so after really the crux of this whole matter culminated. And Marx made an extremely visionary assessment of that situation, probably with very rudimentary research resources at his disposal, but very impressive to read everything that I'm reading in this contemporary book and then hear Marx just lay out a paragraph summarization of that in such an eloquent way.
Yeah, because at the time, Marx is using information where what we call race pseudoscience and stuff, phrenology and shit like that. That's the science of the day while he's writing this. And I think a lot of people like to criticize Marx for having, maybe a little bit of outdated information. And I think people get a little bit too dogmatic, following some of the things that he may have said at that time. Not going to go into specifics, but the point is that the dude is dealing with information from the middle 1800s that, by today's standards is ridiculous, outdated, inaccurate.
Of course.
So, and for him to still come up with a pretty decent take of this, that's kind of progressive of the time.
So now I think it's important to cover the topic that you were alluding to a moment ago about indigenous and global colonized, I guess we could call them, populations, and this concept of wage labor. So this concept of wage labor was not only alien, but it was not very appealing to many people. So if you go down to, let's say, Guatemala, let's use Guatemala as an example, and you say, I have a coffee plantation. I know that you own some land, a mile or so away, and that land produces food that feeds you and your family and your immediate little community. What say you come on down to my coffee plantation and work for pennies? How's that
to
sound?
be fair, I don't think that this whole setup was very popular even with the people in England at the time. I feel like there was a lot of resistance to this.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So this concept of enclosure. But so this
does sound like a ripoff, Franker.
And this is during the 1800s, where you see a liberal revolution in okay, I'm sorry, I don't want to get too ahead on that, but so you have to imagine you have these Guatemalan, these indigenous Mayans that have lived ancestrally off land to feed themselves and their families. Our Ben's our spiritual advisor would like to have a word with you. How about you leave all that land that you got down there, all the food, your traditional ways of living, and why don't you come labor for 16 hours a day for pennies that you can only use, for the things that we've established, and we'll give you like plantation notes that convert into currency in a very strange way that you don't really care about. Or isn't really relevant to your way of living whatsoever. So
doesn't that sound so appealing?
Yeah, you can imagine that this was not an extremely popular concept to many of the indigenous tribes that had indigenous communities that had subsisted on that area for generations. So
time immemorial.
European and European-blooded descendants decided that what needed to happen was to dispossess them of their ancestral lands. This was a two-pronged benefit to the liberal revolution of these areas. For one, we need this land anyway for coffee and bananas. Coffee and bananas is what we're going to be making. They got land, we're going to take it. But the second part, which is relevant to the discussion that we're having now, is that we need wage laborers, and these people just don't want a wage labor. They just they're content to just farm and survive and live the way they want to live. So
live happily, rest whenever they want to. It's just I don't get it. It's not cooking.
So, when we steal their land from them, they have no choice. It's either work for us or starve. And I actually have a quote here. This is from 1885, which is kind of like the advent of the liberal revolution of Guatemala. I believe Guatemala achieved independence in 1821. I'm going to talk about Central and South American independence in a moment. But in 1885, the Minister of Development stated that it is necessary to make the Indian work for his own good, for the good of business and for the country, because as a result of his apathetic and stationary character and his few needs, he is satisfied with practically nothing. So this is a Guatemalan official, Ministry of Development, pretty much stating like the Indians just won't work for us. We have to force them to work. We have to, in effect, enslave them so that they will work for us because they are stationary and apathetic. And by stationary and apathetic, essentially what they're referring to is the lack of interest of indigenous communities to engage in bourgeois consumerism and wage labor. So the only way to counteract that was with coercive land dispossession and labor laws. So not only did this play out in Guatemala and pretty much all throughout the colonized world, but this was actually also playing out in Europe itself. This was happening in the transition from feudalism to capitalism, the wrenching of the lands and forcing a population to either produce more or migrate to cities to work in factories.
Well, you see, Frankster, it's this thing called the free market. All right. Doesn't it sound so free? I mean, like, wouldn't you? I mean, sure, you're able to have all your basic needs met doing, like, the very things that, like, your family and everyone you've known has done for, like I said before, time immemorial, generations upon generations. But what if you could get more? And isn't that just human nature, just to want more and not to just, live peacefully? Like, aren't you, like, always willing to go for the unknown rather than what will actually pay off? And be all right. I'm kidding, and I'll be right back. I gotta get water, but please continue, Pat.
Okay, yeah, I'll just keep going here a little bit. So now we can also look at this dynamic as it played out in Ireland, one of England's earliest colonies. So this concept of enclosure, which was a campaign to take the land that was communally and traditionally cultivated by the peasant populations, forcing them off that land and forcing them into a contract of wage labor, or at least an implicit contract of wage labor. This same dynamic was imposed on Ireland in 1585, specifically, is when they began this process of dispossessing them of their land, forcing them into wage labor transactions for survival. This is what caused more of like a monocropping culture within Ireland, which then, had them focus so much on potatoes because it was something that they could grow on a relatively small amount of land and with extremely dense calories that could feed a large portion of the population. As we all know, there was an extremely deadly potato famine, which occurred in Ireland in 1845. The English enclosure essentially forced Ireland into monocropping potatoes, and over 10% of the population died. During this time, while people were starving in mass across the entire Irish island, Britain was receiving 30 to 50 shiploads of food to England and Scotland every day that this famine was occurring. So we can definitely see
So it's not just that they were monocropping; it's just that the crops that weren't potatoes, right, were being shipped out every day. As how many people died?
Exactly. Well, it was like 1 million people, but at the time, this was within Irish population. That's a 10%. So, if we look at it in terms of relative, obviously Ireland's a relatively small landmass with a relatively small population compared to a lot of other countries. Just thinking of it in terms of how widespread that is like massive starvation.
Yeah. But the line can't go down.
Line must
go.
You
must sacrifice grandma for the line.
So, and now, so this is also something that I found interesting. And I've read about this a little bit before, but I never heard it put into these terms. Ask a liberal what their or a capitalist, should I say? I kind of use those somewhat interchangeably. Ask them what their opinion is of the labor theory of value. Can you give me an example of what someone might say if you advocate the labor theory of value to your average liberal capitalist? Johnny?
Oh, I thought you were waiting for a response from chat, as was I.
No, I don't care if chat or you the I don't want dead air.
All right, fine. If I was to like try and put on my liberal brain again, and
basic uneducated answer that you could get.
Like labor theory of value. It's like, well, if you don't like the wages that you're getting, at your current job, why don't you just go someplace else?
Sure. I was thinking a little bit more along the lines of like, maybe this is a little bit more educated, where people say that labor is inherently meaningless. Like, just because you labor on something doesn't mean that it generates any value necessarily.
So I don't even think they go that far into it. I don't think anybody thinks that far into it. Like, oh, well, I worked on it, so
this is something that I hear commonly. This is something I hear commonly from chuds and the like. But so this brings us to John Locke, who is like one of like the godfathers of liberal
fucking
ideology.
Bastard.
Yeah. So have you ever heard of John Locke's labor theory of property?
Dude literally had to twist his own goddamn theory for it to even fucking make sense.
Do you know what his general theory was on labor and property?
Oh, what the fuck was it? That if you work the land, then it's yours.
Exactly. And then
with a caveat.
Exactly. There was a caveat to this. The caveat being that if you improve the land, just because somebody's working it and they don't know how to necessarily work it, if you acquire the land and you improve it, it then becomes your property. And this was the underlying philosophy of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which is what stimulated the Trail of Tears, which was essentially a genocidal process of mass deportation of the eastern and Midwest, like east of the Mississippi area, Native American population being driven westward in a extremely dangerous and fatal series of events. So we see.
I just thought of something ago. What?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's funny how, like, for all like the free market, fucking invisible hand jerk offs, right? Like, not one of them has tried to apply like Locke's theory on Musk, right? Because I'll tell you one thing, he has definitely not fucking improved Twitter. So just because he's working it, right, and that's like technically property, right? It's like people always refer to it as like the fucking digital commons or some shit. He's definitely working it, but he's making it worse. It's not getting any better. He's making it worse than it was before, which, I'm all here for. I'm not one of these people that's like, oh, save Twitter. It's like, nah, fuck it. Let that shit burn.
Yeah. So now, just like a quick recap, you know what I mean? We've started from the year 1500, where England was not particularly special in any way, not technologically, not economically, not production-wise or anything like that. England and other European nations had to find a way to garner resources and wealth that is going to have them ascend past other more powerful nations such as China and India. They find this through colonization, resource extraction, and slavery. Then this is all underlined by liberal theories of property and private ownership, such as what we were going over with John Locke. So now I want to go into like a more specific instance of this whole process playing out, something that was critical to the British Empire, and that is what happened in India. As we all know, England colonized India in I believe like the 1700s is when that began with the East India Trading Company. The 1600s. I'm sorry. Initially colonized trade routes by the East India Trading Company in the 1600s. And then later, Britain would assume administrative control over India in the year 1800, or I'm not sure if it was exactly the year 1800, but roughly. This is so important to what we were discussing earlier, because I know that Sam brought up the global South can harvest several times a year. This is really going to illustrate the not natural turn of events that changed the way that India historically worked its lands. So when British assumes this administrative control over India, they want India to produce cash crops. India historically has not. I mean, I'm sure they produce some cash crops, relevant and valuable crops, but that's not what England wants. England wants things like cotton, indigo, wheat, rice, opium, and they want them in mass. They want to churn out as much of these cash crops that they can extract and sell or utilize themselves, more than they want anything else that India may have been producing. Now, India and many other nations had a extremely well-honed and sophisticated way of working land for subsistence. They knew the way that land worked at one point of the year, and then after you harvest, you can utilize that same plot of land for something else. I don't know if you've ever heard about this in Latin America, but there's this thing called like the Three Kings or something like that. I forget exactly what it's called, but it's
it's like the corn, and there's like one other one. Shit.
It's corn, I believe, potatoes.
It's Three Sisters farming, I think.
The Three Sisters, exactly. That's exactly it. And they knew about the like biologically symbiotic way that they could farm the land in the way that it's going to be
corn, bean, and squash.
Corn, beans, and squash. There you go. Okay.
There you go. Thank you, Frank.
Sorry about that. I apologize for slipping that. I didn't have anything written about that. But this is just an example of the way the more sophisticated methods that indigenous populations had of working their land. So when England arrives and they say, nah, we're not doing all that stuff that you were doing. What we want are these 5 things that are going to make us the most money, and we want it taken out of the country so that we can profit off of it.
Right.
This drastically changed and hampered India's, as well as other countries, ability to sustain drought and famine.
Right.
India, a place that had been historically resilient, They're not without their issues. They're not without their famines and things like that. But they had a internal resistance to this because they were producing enough grain and enough food, and they knew how to work their lands in a way that they could insulate themselves to these types of ecological disasters.
I mean, India is like, it's not even just like people all the time like to bring up like how like culturally, vast, India is, and how, many different kind of cultures and peoples and faiths and all this other stuff. But it's also like ecologically like a very diverse place. You have everything from like desertous mountains to straight up jungle. You have,
I was there in both of those things.
Yeah, you were there.
Yeah, I visited deserts and jungles and urban beaches. All of it. It's like a big New Jersey.
India has every place you need. Yeah,
so
that's another funny fucking point, is that you probably have, right, these English people coming to this country, right, that like salt is too spicy to them, right? Like, their farming methods are like, we have potatoes, and what else do they have? Like, I guess wheat to make bread, right? People just eating like fucking white bread, never even heard of naan, never even heard of like, fucking any other kind of shit, right?
Apparently sugar accounted for 22% of their calories.
Right.
like a ton of sugar.
Right. So, and then they're going to go to India, and they're probably going to tell these people, no. This is how you do it.
When India has like literally the most fragrant and dynamic, flavor palette out of any food that I've ever consumed. They figured it out. They know how to make food. And, in my time in India, let me tell you, they know how to make it over there.
I've been to England. They don't. Everybody eats curry for a reason.
Like beans on toast. So, like I was saying, now imagine this. Now, in the years, in the 19th century, you have a nation, or like not barely even a nation. It's more like a subcontinent that for generations and generations and centuries had perfected its method of agriculture to sustain its population, to feed its people, and to subsist on the land that they were provided. Now you have England coming through. They're going to start directing shit. They're going to say, you're not making this shit here anymore. You're going to make this. You're going to make this. This is the cash crops. This is how we're completely converting your nation's agriculture. So this book here by the late great Mike Davis, recently passed away. Rest in peace.
R.I.P. to a real one.
One of my favorite books that I've ever read, especially on the topic of third world development. It's called Late Victorian Holocaust, El Nino Famines, and the Making of the Third World. El Nino is this. I'm sorry, this is something that I'm not super, not an expert on, but it's a weather condition which causes drought. And it's been happening for a long time. It happened before Britain got to India, and it happened after the British got to India. And prior to the British getting to India, it occurred. And while it was difficult, India persevered. Afterwards, after these radical changes were made to convert India into a majority cash crop agricultural system, when the El Nino famine came, it was disastrous. It was a catastrophe of fatalities. The El Nino droughts hit twice in the late 1800s, in 1870 and 1878, which were the worst years of the drought. And within this whole thing, roughly 30 million Indian people died between the years 1877 and 1902 from two separate El Nino droughts occurring. This was not something that was due just to drought. Drought has occurred. El Nino droughts had occurred prior, and India was able to persevere to some degree. During this time, in 1877 and 1878, which were the worst years of the drought, record amounts of grain were being shipped to Europe rather than feeding starving Indians. From 1875 to 1900, grain exports increased from 3 million to 10 million tons annually. So this is what was going on. This is, when that person, Shawshank, was in here saying about like some kind of egalitarian colonization and how there was, many benefits, things done for the benefit of India. These are the types of
the modernizing of India, Pat.
Right, exactly. And I just wanted to bring this up real quick just to illustrate this a little bit. We haven't done any screen shares so far.
Now we've been very just,
dialogue based,
dialogue heavy.
So here you go. Great Famine of India of 1876 to 1878. Preceding events. The Great Famine may have been partially caused by intense drought resulting in the crop failure. It's part of a larger pattern of drought and crop failure across India, China, South America, and parts of Africa, caused by the interplay between a strong El Nino and active Indian Ocean dipole that led between 19 and 50 million deaths. The regular export of grain. The regular export of grain by the colonial government continued. During the famine, the Viceroy, Lord Robert Belwer-Lytton, oversaw the export to England and of a record 6.4 million hundredweight tons of wheat, which made the region more vulnerable. The cultivation of alternative cash crops, in addition to the commodification of grain, played a significant role in the defense. And they actually have this book right here by Mike Davis. So this was like a utterly catastrophic situation that occurred within India as a direct result of man-made issues that were caused by the situation. One moment. Yeah. So we see massive amounts of death. They were unable to have any kind of relief because they had no grain stores. Everything was being shipped out to Europe, and they had nothing to insulate them from the issue. So yeah, that's just one example of how this level of capitalistic resource accumulation affected India because of Europe's agricultural policy.
Jesus. And it's not even as if, like, this was just going on without any kind of resistance either. I mean, just like in, Europe, who had a number of rebellions against all of this. In India, you had the same thing.
Yeah, there was a number of rebellions against the colonial procedures.
So there was a crop failure, but the grain that was exported was still sufficient to feed most of India. I mean, like Pat said earlier, that they had famines from time to time. They did have seasons or ecological events like an El Nino happen probably even before, right? The issue is that because they are also monocropping, right, and their crops are being exported, they have an even worse footing to handle something like an El Nino because it's not up to them. As to how their crops are used or how where their food is going.
Yeah. Yes. So as we were saying, that there was previous droughts that happened that were extremely similar to this. If you want to look into it, there's this book goes into it in excruciating detail with tables and statistics and everything like that, specifically on the situation in India as well as many other places in the world, that they were able to sustain themselves and not have these massive death tolls in the millions because they worked their land more efficiently in terms of what it causes in a subsistence sense, and then also had massive amounts of grain reserves on hand that they could utilize during times of drought, which weren't being exported by the thousands and thousands of tons out to Europe.
Yeah, because I just wanted to make sure it was the right year. It actually happened earlier than this famine. The Indian Mutiny erupted in May 1857 when sepoys rose up against the British in Meerut and then massacred all the British they could find in Delhi. Uprising spread throughout British India. It was estimated that less than 8,000 of nearly 140,000 sepoys remained loyal to the British. And there's, a lot more involved with that, but I think we can cover that at another time.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that this book should be on our list of things that we should be reading and covering. It's a little bit big, but it's one of my favorite books I've ever read for sure.
Absolutely. Especially since he passed very recently. I think we should go over it.
After holding up one of my favorite books, I do need to quote the author. And this is quote is so pertinent to the situation. Mike Davis says of the situation in India and the other ensuing famines that happened as a result of it. Millions died, not outside of the modern world system, but in the very process of being forcibly incorporated into its economic and political structures. They died in the golden age of liberal capitalism. That's OG Mike Davis, one of the most based Marxist writers, probably of our current time. Unfortunately, he just passed away, I think, within the last month.
I think it was like cancer or something like that.
He was an older guy, so I wouldn't be surprised.
So Sam
is
talking about like this interview with Rania Khalek and Utsa Patniak. They said it really gets going around like 40 or 45 minutes. I don't know if it's up to you if you want to try and like pull it up, because they're saying that like, it says how sinister colonization really went.
Sure.
Cancer gun for Mike Davis. I don't know, maybe. How old was he? He was 76.
I'm just gonna. There's obviously so much time we can put on this, but I'll put it up now.
Yeah, I think just skip ahead to like the 40-minute mark, and now we're already here, Sam.
When I studied Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, I knew there was a problem with it. There was a very big problem. There was a logical fallacy in it. But it is one thing to realize there's a fallacy in the theory, but another thing to pinpoint it. Where exactly is the fallacy? Because Ricardo was an extremely intelligent person. His formal level of formal argumentation was so high, so good. There is nothing wrong in his formal argument, which says that he takes the two-country, two-good model. The two countries were Britain and Portugal. The two goods were woolen cloth in Britain and wine in Portugal. And he says that even if Portugal produced both cloth and wine at a lower cost per unit than Britain did, it would still be beneficial for these two countries to specialize and enter into exchange, depending on where the relative cost advantage is. That is, if Portugal produced wine relatively more cheaply than it produced cloth compared to Britain, Portugal should specialize in wine production. Britain should specialize in cloth production. And if they exchange, then actually the output would increase. They could each enjoy a higher level of consumption of one good or the same level of consumption of the other good in the post-trade situation compared to the pre-trade. There's nothing formally wrong in the argument at all. But what is wrong in the argument is in the assumption. The assumption is that both the countries could produce both the goods, but England could not produce grape wine because.
You think we should move ahead here at all, or
let's move ahead. Sorry, Sam.
In this video, or
climate does not permit it.
If there's like a clip that's like more like specific that you want us to play, we can definitely get on that.
Yeah.
All right.
But thank you, Sam.
No, actually, I really want to check that out a little bit more later because it seems really interesting and quite on topic for everything that we said.
Yeah.
So let's see. Okay.
Basically, they paid the Indian workers with the same money that the Indian workers paid for their taxes. I mean, that's not too different from what we have going on here now. So,
basically, they paid Indian workers for their products with the same money that the Indian workers paid for their taxes. Yeah, Dex, you got to, like, I mean, I don't know what you want me to respond to the things that you're saying. Like, if you have something relevant you want to contribute, I'll gladly have a dialogue with you. If not, I mean, I'm just going to ignore it because you're not really saying anything.
All right, let's move on.
Okay. All right. So the next section, how Britain underdeveloped Africa, which is obviously an ode to the extremely influential How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by the based King Walter Rodney.
I swear to God, it's like you've got like a library just like literally right underneath. Books on books.
Well, I mean, when I was doing my reading and I was like preparing everything, I did grab some relevant texts to have on hand just in case I needed them. Because you remember last time when I had to like run downstairs, to grab the Sashi Tharoor book because I was arguing with that guy. So I just like to have them on hand in case I ever need them. I don't have to run downstairs. Oh, stop. That's so nice of you. All right. So, how Britain underdeveloped Africa. Oh, I'm sorry. I actually mistyped this. It's actually How Britain Underdeveloped Asia is the name of it, but I was so keeping in line with the Rodney book that I accidentally typed Africa when it's actually Asia. So, British Colonial Office hindered and dismantled India's textile industry. So I don't know if you remember this. Anybody that was here during the last stream when I got into that argument with that person, they were saying that India had like nothing technologically or nothing developed or nothing superior in terms of the global market. And that's what I brought up. I said it dowels. I don't know what I said it dowels. I said dowels. It's actually looms. That's what I meant. I don't know if there's a huge difference between a dowel and a loom. I think they're somewhat similar, but the terminology that is frequently used is loom. So because of the extremely developed nature of India's textile industry, the England specifically came in and destroyed many sectors of the English textile operation. I actually have a list here. Hold on one second. That talks about how they would actually crush the fingers of Indian workers to be able to let's see here. So, went as far as to crushing the fingers and destroying looms. The British firms then also received preferential treatment, and they imposed one-way tariffs, which insulated Britain's market from Indian goods while ensuring easy access for British goods in India. Here it is right here. And I tried finding like a somewhat impartial source for this that we can look over. Boom. Okay. Britain took more out of India than it put in. Could China do the same to Britain? I don't know. That's not really relevant to this, but I thought it was pretty funny. So, for at least 2 centuries, the hand-loom weavers of Bengal produced some of the world's most desirable fabrics, especially the fine muslins, which is a word I'm not actually familiar with, light as woven air, that were in such demand for dressmaking and so cheap that Britain's own cloth manufacturers conspired to cut off the fingers of Bengali weavers and break their looms. Their import was ended, however, by the imposition of duties and a flood of cheap fabric, cheaper even than poorly paid Bengali artisans could provide. From the new steam mills of northern England and lowland Scotland that conquered the Indian as well as the British market, India still grew cotton, but Bengal no longer spun or wove much of it. Weavers became beggars, while the population of Dhaka, which was once the great center of muslin production, fell from several 100,000 in 1760 to about 50,000 by the 1820s. So, you can see there that there was let me stop the share. An intentional sabotaging effect that England imposed upon these textile industries. So, with what was the argument in the last stream was that there was like no superior or emerging industries out of India, and England just kind of came in and showed them how to be like technological and industrial and things like that, and thus gave us the I'm specifically employed by George Soros at the Antifa Corporation.
fucking like, yeah, but like the main point that Shashank was trying to make last time was that like, but was it mechanized? Like, were they able to like, that's not like the point. The point is, if you have something that is like, you know, of that kind of level of skill and that level of like rarity, you get to be able to like choose like, you know, how much you want for it.
Well, yeah, and the artisan tradition
Right.
typically would produce things of a higher quality and thus being more in demand. So even by capitalist logic, the more in demand thing is the thing that should, in a sense of meritocracy, should be, you know, rising to the top. But in the case of England and textiles, they had to intentionally sabotage it so that their lesser quality and overly produced through a mechanized sense product could be distributed in a way that outsold the more popular, better quality, artisanal products.
I'm trying to think about what was it called? Like what did they call them? But not like a union or something, but like before there were unions. He talks about how, what is it?
A guild.
Yeah, he talks about how like the guild literally had to have what the fuck is it, like their shit fucked up in order to drive down the costs for a guild to have it on par with like, you know, the mass labor of England. So they literally just like destroyed their own
mechanization in and of itself does not reflect any inherent superiority in a product or in a production, and that's evident here with this boom situation.
Yeah, he said, because employment was relatively scarce, competition among workers drove down the cost of labor, destroying the guild system that had previously protected the livelihoods of craftsmen. Despite desperate to keep their jobs, workers were under heavy pressure to produce as much as possible and regularly worked for 16 hours a day, much more than peasants would have spent working up on their farms before the...
Yeah, I got a great job fucking your mom with my face tattoo.
I mean, look, I'm not gonna ban him unless like Pat wants me to, but like I don't give a shit. You're commenting on our page and you're giving us an extra view. Like, yeah, fuck it. Say as much shit as you want. It's just boosting our stats. I really don't care.
Yeah. But so I did want to illustrate this a little bit too, because I do have this here because we've made frequent mention to it, and also last stream as well as this stream is the GDP share that India and also China, but more on that in a second, had in global economics at the time prior to and after British involvement. So you can see right here, this is a chart of GDP in international dollars. So according to blah, blah, blah. So this is year over here in the year 1500, right here, India accounted for about 25% of global GDP. So for the entire world, 25% of the economy of GDP was India was responsible for. That is in the late medieval period. So let's go down to here, which is known as the colonial era. And let's just take a look down here. So it goes from 24, 22, 24, 16, 12, and now up until even 1990. We have not seen India recover into the double digit area since the colonial era. So in our Shashank redemption arc, in terms of the benevolent forces of colonization at play, this is what you get. Look, even in the negative here in 1950, it actually has negative GDP. So from becoming literally what?
Why are the 60s missing?
I'm looking at the wrong place. I'm sorry. I meant here. This is actually the GDP. I'm sorry.
No, I'm looking at the years, and it's funny how it skips from 1950 to 1990. What was happening in the 60s and the 70s? Who was in power in the 60s and 70s? What was happening then?
Was that Nehru?
I'm pretty certain Nehru was the 60s, right?
I'm sorry. I really don't want to speak out of turn to something that I haven't read a book about or have like the specific information off.
All right.
But I know that. Yeah. Sorry about that. But I'm just illustrating some statistics to demonstrate the negative effect that colonialism had on the GDP or the economic output or the economic viability of India, which was prior to Britain's all-knowing, all mechanized, all technologically superior method of economics, was accounting for like a major significance of the world economy, and now is like dismally dependent and impoverished. So now that has been illustrated,
I think it's kind of funny that, like, you know, they that chart just completely skips over like Indira Gandhi. It skips over Nehru. Like, you know, that period's not important.
yeah, I think that's all just considered like post-independence.
Right.
So now India, you can also talk about China at the same time, because China is that other major economic player that we were discussing for most of for this, India and China being like these two major players. So let's look at China now.
I think it's also pretty interesting that I don't know if we talked about it as much during the last episode, but like China comes up frequently with all of these programs that the UN sets up where they're trying to, like, you want to talk about like fucking with numbers, right? The Millennium Challenge goals and all this other shit that, like, they were trying to do from like the 90s into the 2000s. Constantly we're like debating whether to add or remove China, but when they remove China, right, they're literally doing worse in like the 10 to 15 years that they're trying to achieve these goals. Like, without China, they have no poverty reduction, they have no hunger reduction, right? And it's just
abusing Chinese state programs for the benefit of neoliberal economic prescriptions. So now China, much like India, was a major player in the world economy up until around the year 1500. You can even see here in the year 1600 that China was accounting for 29% of the global GDP. So something happens right around this era. Do you have any idea what happened right around here?
Oh, right around 1870 to 1913. It's a long gap. It's a really long gap.
Do you have anything relevant that happened right around this time? A
century of something happened at that time.
Yeah, but what started off that century? Where does the century of humiliation really kick off?
What was it? I think it was either like the Boxer Rebellion, or was it the no, it was the Opium Wars. The Opium Wars.
The Opium Wars. Now the Opium Wars are just like ridiculous when you actually understand them. So like the Opium Wars was like a weaponized drug market campaign against a nation that was reluctant to open up its markets to international penetration. And through this, a war literally started to be able to sell and distribute opium that was being produced in India, colonized India, and have it disseminated into markets in China, which the King? I believe it's Qing Dynasty was actively doing its best to make illegal because it was having extremely deleterious effects on the population, and Britain went to war with them over it, and then essentially opened them up to more liberalized market forces. So now, this is something that I alluded to earlier, in the sense that when we see this industrialization of Europe and we see the resource extraction, the slavery, the benefits of it, and then what that turns into is manufactured goods that need to be sold. In a capitalist market, you can't just have manufactured goods lingering around. So at this point, European nations are like desperately seeking markets to sell their goods. And Asia is a really interesting study or example of that grotesque desire for markets. So we have this situation of the Opium Wars in China, which I just brought up.
10 years after the second Opium War, because there's not even one, there's two.
Right. So now, just as an example of that, oops, was I sharing screen already?
I wish we could compare, like,
another example of this to kind of go along that, the Convention of Kanagawa. The Convention of Kanagawa, also known as the Kanagawa Treaty, or the Japanese-U.S. Treaty of Peace and Amity, was a treaty signed between U.S. and Japan, signed under threat of force. It effectively meant the end of Japan's 220-year-old policy of national seclusion, and by opening up the ports to American vessels. So, essentially, this was a form of gunboat diplomacy, which essentially states, like, you have to trade with us. Like, it's not even looking to, like, dominate the whole country or take over. In more subversive ways, it does do that, but it's subtle. It's just, gun to your head, you need to start trading with us, which is depraved and interesting. So not only do we see that with Japan, but also nearby, we can see this in Korea. In Korea, we have the General Sherman incident, which where an American merchant ship made an illegal attempt to open trade. This is all it's about, open trade with isolation, with the Chosun dynasty of Korea, during a rapid increase of Western imperialism in Asia during the 19th century. Asian nations came under increasing pressure to end their isolationist policies. So, like, we're looking at, like, literal warfare, armed conflict, not over geopolitical threat, not over domination for literal tangible resources, but just like, we're coming with guns and ships because you need to trade with us. And this policy of isolation is because many of these Asian nations knew what it meant. To open up your nation for this type of economic penetration meant that you would essentially be subordinated by this European country.
You're getting fucked.
Yes, penetrated repeatedly. And actually, what had happened here was that
is this one where
they actually killed all these people in this one.
Is this the one where what's his name? They do kind of like with the Nicolas Cage movie.
The crew of the General Sherman jumped off the ship and were killed by enraged civilians on the shore. Korean officials did not inform the U.S. government of the incident and evaded inquiries on American officials. 5 years later, the United States dispatched a military expedition to Korea, in part to ascertain the fate of the General Sherman. After being ambushed, the expeditionary forces captured and occupied several Korean ports. After a brief battle, the Korean government eventually ended its isolation in the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1876. So we can see this. Actually, hold on. There's one more. Isn't there the one where it's kind of like that Nicolas Cage movie where they steal the Declaration of Independence, but it's a little different? Yeah, it's way different. Hold on. Hold on.
And I'm laughing because it's ridiculous on the Americans' part. And I don't mean that, in any way to disrespect, like, the kind of shit that Korea had to put up with from, like, every fucking part of the world for, like, 2-3 centuries.
And
were you able to pull it up?
I'm trying to find. Hold on. Oh, wait. Actually, I might have it here.
Because it's great. And honestly, I do feel like if they ever do make a movie about this incident, Nicolas Cage should play the captain.
There we go. So, this sounds like it's something out of a comic book. So, Ernst Oppert was a Jewish businessman from Germany, best known for his unsuccessful attempt in 1867 to remove the remains of the father of Regent from their grave in order to use them to blackmail the Regent into removing Korean trade barriers. So, this German industrialist or, individual went into Korea and stole a king's bones out of a mausoleum in an attempt to blackmail Korea into removing trade barriers. That's how depraved the desire for market was at this time. That this guy here was like, how can I trade with not even just me? How can, like, the world trade with, which is relatively like a very small, like, what is the market of Korea? This really shows how depraved and desperate the desire for market accumulation was at this time, that it's like, I'm going to steal their bones and I'm going to use it to blackmail them so that they trade with us.
Imagine being like the first mate on the ship, right, with this guy and just being like,
go.
What's the plan here? Like, I'm going to steal his dad's bones and that's what's going to make them trade with us. You sure about that? You sure that's this is what we fucking
Also,
sailed all the way out here for?
He was also supplied by an American business leader with money and arms. They reached the tomb. They tried to steal the body, but were stopped by a massive stone slab that covered Prince Namion's remains and had to leave without having achieved their objective.
I need to know more about E.F.B. Jenkins.
Yeah,
I need to know what state specifically from.
Yeah, so that now you can kind of see that ridiculous obsession and the necessity for European nations to open up third world or global south nations to capital penetration. Going back to over here. Let me get out of this. During the colonial period in India, income in India declined by over 50%. From 1872 to 1921, the average life expectancy fell by 20%. Europe increased its global GDP from 20 to 60% during the colonial period. And then I thought this quote from Hickel was probably the most pertinent summarization of this concept. It said, Europe didn't develop the colonies developed Europe.
Right.
Now this brings us into like a later stage of colonization, which is the era of like the scramble for Africa. And that's pretty much the conclusion of the chapter. If you feel like going into like the more the colonial endeavors that pretty much covered the entire African continent in the late 19th century, sorry.
From the words of Cecil Rhodes, Britain's most famous colonialist, give us a window into the spirit of the times. I was in the East End of London, a working class quarter, yesterday, and attended a meeting of the unemployed. I listened to the wild speeches, which were just a cry of bread, bread. And on my way home, I pondered over the scene, and I became more than ever convinced the importance of imperialism. My cherished idea is a solution for the social problem, i.e., in order to save 40 million inhabitants of the United Kingdom from a bloody civil war, we colonial statesmen must acquire new lands to settle the surplus population, to provide new markets for the goods produced in the factories and mines. The empire, as I have always said, is a bread and butter question. If you want to avoid civil war, you must become imperialists. And that's such like an insidious way to think of all this, right? That like there is no alternative. Tell me if that sounds at all familiar to you. That like, you know, this man, even this early in the game is like, no, we have to commit like to this. It has to be this monstrous thing. There is no other way. There is no other means. There is no fathomable co-development that can exist.
Well, I actually kind of like appreciated Mr. Rhodes' statement there because it's actually kind of like saying the quiet part out loud.
We didn't have to be quiet about anything back then.
Exactly.
But it's time of chronology, man.
He's saying the precise opposite of what many of the apologists for the colonial era would state is that, you know what I mean? That, you know, that empire and economic superiority do not require very violent and very undemocratic and, you know, otherwise unscrupulous means to be able to obtain and maintain. But Cecil Rhodes is like, no, if you want to develop like this, you have to colonize. You have to be an imperialist. There's no other way. It's either that or civil war. There's the only two ways.
So I guess like he's the only one that's just like, I'm willing to get like, you know, a bit of blood in my teeth, right? Yeah, a necessary evil, Frankster. Because at the time, I guess like should we even make the hypothesis that like the pseudo science racists of the phrenologists of the time were just like trying to think of an out to like, you know, just the inhuman monstrous things that they would commit upon like people that they knew nothing about and would never meet, just for, you know, a bit of tea or a bit of sugar in their tea. Make up 20% of their caloric intake.
Sugar from slave plantations in the Caribbean and tea from India or China.
I mean, it's not much different today. I mean, think about it. Everything that.
China actually, I'm sorry. Tea isn't even actually indigenous to India.
No.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, no. Tea, the only reason that the English even have tea is because of trade with China.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is why they were willing to just be browbeaten by that emperor, just being called fucking just jabronis. Yeah, get out of here with your fucking rags. Silver or gold.
So in some really bizarre way, the massive continent of Africa by this time, mid 19th century, just hadn't been colonized that much, which is interesting because so much of this was happening. The Western Hemisphere was in what is Canada, United States, Central America, and South America are completely colonized by this point. Asia, for the parts that aren't colonized, there is a very deliberate effort to continue to subvert them. Africa, outside of a couple places along the northwestern coast and the south, was relatively uncolonized. I actually have some ways to illustrate that real quick, if you just give me one moment.
I have a theory, right? And I don't know how accurate it is, right? But I mean, if we're talking about why it isn't, I'm gonna say that Africa has fucking lions and shit. Lions, right. Jaguars, fucking Asia has elephants, right? Africa also has elephants and stuff, but also the most dangerous animal in the world that kills more people than fucking mosquitoes, which I don't even know if that really counts because they're just giving diseases and shit. But hippos are the number one killer in Africa. So I'm gonna say that whether they're going by land, you got lions, hyenas, fucking elephants, right? You got poisonous spiders, bro. We grew up watching fucking Crocodile Hunter. We know Africa dangerous, right?
White people are afraid of snakes and spiders.
Yeah, so you got these assholes in plinth helmets, just marching out there, and then fucking lion just sees this dumbass, because especially if they don't have accurate guns at the time, right? They're fucked. What are you gonna do? Take on a pride of 20 fucking lions with a musket and shit? You're getting wrecked.
Okay.
I wish I could take a time machine back and see. I want to see a row of English colonists just getting fucking just grisly, just massacred by bright light.
So here are some maps of Africa as it relates to colonization. So we have here. Let me do a little
What's that country at the top?
Yeah, so here is a map of 1800, the year 1800, of how colonized Africa was. Then we can move down. You can see a little bit more in 1870.
Right.
Then let's go to between 1912 and 1914. We see that Africa goes from being roughly 10% colonized in 1870 to by 1912, over 97% is colonized. The only two places that are technically not colonized are Ethiopia and Liberia, which Ethiopia would later be colonized by Italy later this century. And Liberia is something that you could barely call a sovereign African nation, as for those of you that aren't aware, Liberia in its founding was when Abraham Lincoln or someone was send them back to Africa and have them have their own country. So there was African Americans that were resettled in Liberia so that they could start their own country. I don't know if you ever saw this, but have you ever heard of the Republic of Baltimore?
No. And for the non-Spanish,
I think it's the Republic of Maryland. Actually, here, wait, look at this.
Reino Unido is the United Kingdom.
I laughed very hard when I found this.
I had to Google it.
The Republic of Maryland, also known variously as the independent state of Maryland, Maryland in Africa and Maryland in Liberia, was a country in West Africa that existed from 1834 to 1857 when it was merged into what is now Liberia. The area was first settled in 1834 by freed American slaves and freeborn African Americans, primarily from the U.S. state of Maryland, under the auspices of Maryland State Colonization Society. So, there was a literal country, I guess you could call it. Would it be a country in Africa?
Kentucky in Africa.
Yeah.
No.
There's actually a handful of other ones. You see it?
New
Oh,
Jersey
yeah.
colony was planned, Pat. It was planned.
Yeah. So I feel like when I found this, I laughed about it for quite some time, that there was these like American states being founded within Africa.
Get the fuck out of here.
Yeah. So according to that map, this area wasn't colonized. Which,
but
I think, like exactly, like according to this, in this little, sorry, let me go back to this. Sorry.
They were about to make a Nork of Africa.
According to this, could you imagine if today there existed a New Jersey, like a country in Africa that was just called New Jersey?
Nobody wants to live there, bro. Nobody.
Oh man. Right. So, in 40 years' time, Africa became almost completely colonized. And this was because of a extremely, let's pull this up for organized sit-down table kind of way called the Berlin Conference that occurred in 1884.
Oh, Alemania is Germany. Okay.
Yeah, that's what they call it in Guatemala too, Alemania. Idaho, the capital of Ethiopia. Yeah. So the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885, also known as the Congo Conference, regulated European colonization and trade in Africa during the new imperialism period and coincided with Germany's sudden emergence as an imperial power. Conference order honored by Bismarck. It can be seen as the formalization of the scramble for Africa, which is the invasion, annexation, division, and colonization of most of Africa by 7 Western European powers during a short period known as New Imperialism. Not to be confused with the David Harvey book, New Imperialism. The 10% of Africa that was under formal European control in 1870 decreased by almost 90% by 1914, with only Liberia and Abyssinia, which is Ethiopia, remaining independent. Liberia, like I said, that's a stretch if you're going to say that that's the only non-colonized area.
Oh, America started its domination from day one. Like, you know, we're going to talk about it at some point, but it's not as if, like, you know, Cuba was the first country that, like, America ever embargoed or sanctioned or anything like that. And we'll talk about that when we get to Domenico Lacerdo's book on liberalism. DSA Bulletin. I'm sorry. I don't.
So now we can, to illustrate this kind of scramble for Africa, the most like notorious example of what happened here was the Congo Free State that was colonized by King Leopold II, I believe. Yeah, the second from Belgium. Now, if you want to read a great book about this,
I knew it was coming.
Leopold's Ghost. Yeah, this is by Adam Hochschild. This is one of the most incredible historical texts I've ever read regarding the colonization process and the brutality that was carried out in the Congo Free State by Belgian forces. So the Congo Free State, which Belgium assumed control of, the Congo is an area in like interior Africa, and Belgium, let me see if I can find something, Belgian Congo. Belgium was like kind of like felt like they were taking like a backseat to the rest of Africa, the rest of Europe, as they were developing their empires.
Right.
Belgium and King Leopold were like, dude, we can never ascend to like political relevancy without a colony. The only way that we can do this is with a colony. So he sets out on this like intense campaign to acquire a colony. And
does Belgium even have that like big of an army?
No. This actually wasn't even a technically Belgian colony. It was actually a private colony of King Leopold. So now in this year, late 19th century, this is where you see the advent of this industrial revolution. Something that became exceedingly important during this time was rubber. And obviously, rubber isn't very quick to come by in most of Europe. But in the Congo, there's an abundance of rubber trees. And with this colonization process, rubber became an extremely relevant commodity to making like hoses and tires and wires and all the things that go.
That's where all the bicycles fucking come in.
What, like in Belgium, like the Belgian?
Yeah, that's why it's from the rubber trees in the Congo.
So, King Leopold and the Belgian forces colonized the state, the nation of the Congo, and they imposed brutal forced labor practices, which forced these Congolese individuals to harvest rubber at certain quotas, and if the quotas were not met, they would have their hands amputated. Now, actually, they weren't even supposed to amputate the hands; they were supposed to kill them. But in this kind of like brutal dystopian world, they said you can't waste bullets on non-lethal shots. So if you waste bullets, you better have hands to account for how many bullets you used. If you use 10 bullets, I want to see 10 severed hands. So in, I guess, some way of having mercy on people, they would just chop the hands off of living individuals. And then in an extremely dystopian turn of events, African tribes started going to war with one another, or Congolese tribes started going to war with each other and cutting off each other's hands, because then they could use some other division of the not their own tribe. They could use another tribe's hands to say, this is the reason why we came up short on our exceedingly difficult to meet rubber quotas. So that's just an example of this like era, and this went on into the 20th century.
This is akin. Wait, this went on into this one. So this is akin to like what Christopher Columbus was doing, right? Where if you didn't have the right amount of gold, you wouldn't get the copper necklace. If you didn't have like the copper, it wasn't a copper neck. It was like a little piece of copper on a string around your neck, and if you didn't have that, right, they would chop off your hands. In fact, what is it? Bartholomew del whatever, the priest that was present in on the island, or is his name Bartholomew? I forget. He mentions him in the book, but I've heard his name come up a couple times where like people have said like, oh, why don't we change Columbus Day to this guy? Because like, he acknowledges that there's like a genocide going on that like Columbus is committing. You read Howard Zinn's book. I think it's like a People's History or something. He actually like, tells you about the account of like, these two conquistadors coming upon a boy with like a parrot, and they like, they like, kill the parrot, and they chop off his hands just for being there. And like, that was like a big thing, is that like, if you didn't produce enough gold, they would just lob off your hands. And it's just so fucked up. Also, isn't this the dude that like you were telling me about, that one book that you were reading where it's just like a couple of people that went on to like, basically serve Hitler during the Holocaust, kind of like got their start like in Belgium? Or is this a different guy?
That was Namibia. That was German-controlled Namibia during the early 20th century genocides. I don't even want to understate it and say massacre. The genocides that occurred in Namibia of the Herero and the Nama tribes under German colonization. Most of the colonial troops would later go on to serve or support or endorse the Nazi Party that would come over the next decade or so, and that many of the undertones of the Nazi Party in terms of the concept of Lebensraum, the concept of racial superiority, the concept of clearing out space for German expansion, all of these things were prevalent, popular, and celebrated concepts well before Hitler, before the Nazi Party. This was not only even in Germany, but in many European countries, these concepts were heralded as progressive science, biological tenets.
Right. Well, I mean, like, not to get too off track, but like, when you think about America as nothing more but an extension, right, of the English Empire, like from day one, and if you consider all of these things that like the English Empire did in order to claim the Americas, right? It kind of just makes you feel like fascism was kind of born here, especially if like fascism is inspired by the US. It really does, you know. I don't know, but that's a whole other kind of like conversation for another stream, I guess.
Well,
Yeah, Manifest Destiny. What's the difference?
Hitler and the Nazis were inspired by the United States. They thought that they could make the rest of Europe like the United States. They said, look at America. America is the most successful country in the world. And they did it because white Europeans went and they took the land off of people that didn't deserve it because they weren't ethnically, capable or whatever, something in their ethnicity or in their biology. So they pointed the finger at Slavs, mostly Slavs. I mean, obviously there was the Jewish situation, which had which they were definitely genociding the Jews. But I feel like the Slavic portion of it is very frequently understated. That they had planned to wipe out, Slavic barbarian nations to their east and use places like Ukraine and places like the Soviet Union as their settlement, as their colonial settlement.
Their breadbasket, so to speak. I mean, he even talks about it like in Mein Kampf, right? That like he was gonna make the whole Russia, all of it, right? The whole Slavic region was gonna be like these tiny little like fiefdoms with like Teutonic German like Nazi knights with like their own territory with these little farmlands that were going to be worked by their Slavic slaves.
Yeah, they were. Hitler said explicitly that he was going to turn Ukraine into a slave plantation.
Yeah,
to provide grain for the rest of the Nazi Empire, the burgeoning Nazi Empire. And then you have Ukrainian collaborate. That's what confuses me so much about Ukrainian and Yugoslavian state collaborationists with Germany. They aided Germany in the imprisonment and execution of Jews in mass, but it was an explicit part of Hitler's colonial doctrine, you could even call it, to do the same to Slavs.
You see the same thing when you look at the history of U.S. expansion, right? Where indigenous nations side with the colonizers, either like the French or the English or sometimes even the Americans against other nations, and hindsight is 2020, man.
And this is something that I think is that is necessary to state too. Even if you go back 5 minutes ago when I was talking about the brutality of the Congo Free State, where I didn't even mention over 10 million people died during the Belgian colonization and forced labor practices that was inflicted upon the Congo. Even within that, there was Congolese collaborators the whole time. They were known as the Force Publique. They were the armed, they were armed regulatory body that imposed rubber quotas and collected rubber. You know what I mean? Obviously, there was tons of Belgian people that were there. There were Belgian people there orchestrating things, but there was also Congolese people that collaborated for their own monetary benefit. And you can find this in almost any instance of a atrocity or some kind of deeply unethical control over an area, whether it's French colonialism in Vietnam or any of these places. You will find a contingent of the population that is supportive of it. You do it in Cuba. There was obviously Cuban people that were extremely financially incentivized to go along with empire.
So here's the thing, right? And I won't take up too much time, and I don't want to go too far into this, right? When I try to talk to my father's side of the family, and it's been like a slow trickle over my entire life to even learn as much as I do about my father's side of the family. I did not inherit my father's complexion. On my father's side of the family, they come from Mumbai, right? And a lot of other different places in India. And you know, whenever I try to talk to like my dad's like aunt and stuff, you know, they have all the history about like, you know, the Portuguese that came, or like, you know, the Italian, you know, that came to India and married like, you know, an Indian woman, or like the English that like, you know, came, and like, you know, this is you know, all I have are like little pictures of these like, you know, scanned photos of these Indian people. I have nothing more than a name. I don't have any kind of family name. They don't know anything about her, and there's very little interest, you know, for them. You know, unlike me, where it's just like, no, I want to know more about them. I want to know more about like, you know, these Indian you know, people that like married the colonizer. I want to know about them. I want to know like, you know, what their family history was, and it's like lost to time. You know, I'll never know anything about them. And so like my own family, right, you know, is a little bit of gusano, so to speak. You know, I don't know if India has like a term for that. I'm technically Anglo-Indian. You know.
You know, a couple streams ago, we talked about the concept of inventing reality and how global, you know, a confluence of geopolitical and economic hegemony has a influencing effect in terms of population, sometimes it being even subconscious. So, you know, it affected me for many years of my life, most of my life, up until just a few recent years of political consciousness, that I was implicitly Eurocentric. You know what I mean? I would have almost, like I said, subconsciously agreed with many Eurocentric narratives of the world. Like, just like what Shashank was saying last year. If somebody would have come up to me 5 years ago and been like, you know, colonialism was fucked up, but, you know, there was a lot of technological innovation. We would never have gotten today. Whatever, we sanitized water and built railroads. I would have been like, damn, yeah, that's a good point. And then I would have gone on watching like reality TV or whatever normal people. You know what I mean? Like, I would have just accepted that, and whatever makes me a little bit more comfortable in my position of luxury in the imperial core, whatever kind of justified that in a way, I would probably cling to pretty quickly. Something that wouldn't make me grapple with the very grim questions of, you know, how just even my middle class existence is, you know, achieved indirectly through many, many bodies of dispossessed third world individuals.
So this actually brings up an excellent point that I'm going to quote the book in a second, but like, I remember I had a conversation with my dad years ago. This is before, you know, I knew anything about socialism, before I really knew much about anything related to this kind of history, where he said something along the lines of, if we didn't colonize the Americas, someone else would have. Right. And I don't know if I buy into that, and there's no way to really like prove that, but there's this point in the book where he says the global south could theoretically have developed as Europe did were it not for the plunder of its resources and labor, and were it not for the fact that it was forced by Europe's supply to supply raw materials while importing manufactured goods. Whether or not they would or should have done so is another matter. Of course, after all, much of European-style development required violence towards other lands and other peoples. But the point remains, it is impossible to examine the economic growth of the West without looking at the base on which it drew. And it's impossible for us to ever know.
Listen, I don't see any benefit in us dealing in counterfactuals. We could all, you know, draw these hypothetical conclusions about what would have happened, what could have happened. And I also, this is a common thing, like, and I kind of referred to this earlier, about this erroneous erroneous whataboutism that gets applied to the plight of like colonized or otherwise like other injustices throughout history. So if you go to make an indictment about the treatment of Native Americans in the United States, some chud will be like, yeah, but you know what they were doing to each other? They were killing each other and sacrificing each other. And they do the same thing about Africa. You know, like, hey, slavery was bad. Well, they were enslaving themselves. It's like, yeah, well, guess what? If there was a Lenape world order that was absolutely that used the displacement of other other Native American tribes in the area to ascend to a degree of global hegemony. Guess what? I would be criticizing the Lenape global world order that used dispossession and exploitation to achieve that level of global dominance. If there was a what is it called? The Sokofo Caliphate? Is that what it's called? Sokofo?
What?
Okay, yeah, it's the Sokoto Caliphate, which was a Muslim empire that enslaved a lot of Africans during that time. If the Sokoto Caliphate was in the position that the United States is currently in, I would have a lot to say to them about their slave practices. But what percentage of the population is currently Lenape?
Not a lot. Not a lot of the population is currently.
What percentage of global dominance is attributed to Muslim empire slavers from 15th century, 16th century Africa?
I'm gonna be honest with you. I don't think I even heard that argument about the Muslim Caliphate also partook in the slave.
Well,
trade.
they wouldn't even know the actual names of it.
I didn't.
Slavery was a practice throughout Africa, and it was mostly just from what I'm reading in my African history class, it was a lot of Muslim empires in Africa that put forward it by religious means, much like the same way that Spain said that it was justified to enslave individuals in the New World because they weren't Christians. That it was you were justified in the enslavement process because of that. Right. Muslim nations in Africa used the same thing. It was the Quran explicitly said that you could not enslave other Muslims, but if you went to war and captured non-Muslim slaves, then that was perfectly ethical within their framework.
Right.
What I'm saying though is that when I'm criticizing the United States or any European nation for utilizing colonization, slavery, unequal exchange, neocolonialism, any form of imperialism for currently being in their current you've heard this, right? That people say, oh, well, people have been colonizing each other for centuries. People have been killing each other since the beginning of time. It's but let's look at who has a grotesquely disproportionate control of the world and how they got there. And yes, we can criticize that. We can go back to some, time in the Mughal Empire of India and talk about how fucked up they were, but they're not controlling the world right now.
No,
they're not. A third of the planet isn't, dependent on them economically because they have been absolutely neutered and sabotaged to a point where they can't support themselves on their own resources because they're being extracted.
Right.
So I think that really takes any wind out of the sails of that argument.
Right. I don't know. I was just gonna bring up that it's interesting that throughout, because you definitely see an influence or an interaction between the Muslim Caliphate and the Christian world, right? Obviously, you see this all taking place in Europe, but when you look at what history we can find about these cultures, from their own perspective in North and South America, you see a culture of being able to trade. You see a myriad of different languages of different cultures, when you look at that map on whose land am I on, you see overlapping territories because you see the ability for these people to have shared resources, shared land, shared territories, and I think that it's just something that at some point I hope that we're able to kind of get into.
Absolutely. I mean, but I just think it's absolutely erroneous to appeal to that when that did not result in a dominant place in what we just laid out the past 2.5 hours is a material, material, statistical, informative chain of events that led Europe from a otherwise non-impressive state of the world to the foundation for the empire that it would become.
Right.
So,
And
you know, this isn't some kind of like counterfactual, like, I don't know, if somebody else would have done it, maybe they would have done it. Okay, well, if they did it, I would be criticizing them in the exact same way.
Right. And the like most fucked up part of all is, and I believe it was Radhika Desai, or it was Samira Min that talks about, like, it's literally nothing more than like the chance that England would have like the Gulf Stream that would take it across the Atlantic to the New World, because, you know, China, you know, is not going to cross the entire Pacific when it's got, like, you know, the rest of the Asian continent. You know, Africa isn't going to, like, you know, sail across it because they don't have the Gulf Stream near it. Plus they have like the rest of, like, you know, Asia to trade with. So it just leaves like this tiny little fucking pissant peninsula of Asia, right? Just by chance had this Gulf Stream to, you know, basically wreak havoc on the world and change everything forever for the worse, and the reason why we're all just like in pain all the time.
And that's why 2/3 of the population can't get enough food.
Yeah.
Of the global population. That's what I was referring to, the world, by the way.
Yeah. It's more like 5/6 of the world.
Yeah, I mean, that's about everything that I have prepared for this chapter. Obviously, we're only going about 40 pages. Let's see what we have coming next. Actually, no, we'll discuss that off stream. I don't want to like.
Gotcha. Do you want to start like winding it down?
Yeah, I'm getting hungry and tired.
Gotcha. So, you know,
I had to start work at 8 o'clock in the morning today, and I pretty much just worked up until about 4, and then prepared for this, changed the cat litter so I didn't smell it the whole time.
Cat box just off screen.
The cat box is literally right over here. That's why if you ever see me like standing up and just kind of disappearing for a second, it's because I have to let the cats in. If they're scratching at the door, I have to do it.
Yeah. It all comes down to just like one little ocean current fucking everything up for everybody. And for a very small, tiny, like, it's because it's not even like everybody in England honestly benefited. I mean, obviously with the amount of people that, like, you know,
I just thought about this too. I mean, there is, like, I understand that I would never like just hand wave away that argument that maybe another empire would colonize and control the world the same way that Europe and in extension the United States has. But also, you know what I mean, you even read the texts of Christopher Columbus when he arrived at Hispaniola, that he was dealing with an extremely communal society that didn't seem extremely hell-bent on like resource accumulation and things like that. Not to say that couldn't have been some point in their development. Like I said, dealing in counterfactuals is pretty much useless. But, you know, you can definitely say that by the evidence that we have provided to us by Christopher Columbus's diaries, is that they had a very different mentality than he did and other European individuals did at that time. But I'm sure you can point to like I said, I was just talking about the caliphates in in Africa that were doing very similar things. You know, if they ascended to prominence, I don't see why they wouldn't have, you know, exerted something similar. But then they would be deserving of all the same criticisms that I'm levying against England and the United States and France and Spain.
Right. Anybody could make like any of those like kind of arguments about, and especially bringing up like the Inca or the Aztec or the Maya or any of these other like very large civilizations that like existed, like, you know, in the Central and South. But you still find evidence of trade from like northeastern Canada down to southwestern fucking Mexico. Right, you see, like, you know, a very interconnected network of people that like are able to trade, exchange ideas, and all of these other things. So, I don't know. It's just it's kind of wild. We could all be speaking Italian if it weren't for that Gulf Stream. I don't know about Italian, but like, you know. I still think we'd all probably be eating noodles in one form or another, and we would all have.
I love a good noodle, man. I am eating noodles.
Yeah, some form of a dumpling would still exist, no matter what. Yeah, just want to say like thank you for everybody.
It's really a bummer that we're at like the end of it right now, and we have the most people that we've had all streaming here right now at 12. And 2 just left. Just
you shouldn't have said anything, Pat. We could have just kept going.
To make me look like an idiot.
Yeah, we could have just like gone the React Andy route and just started like looking at stuff on Twitter or something. Or I don't know.
Ben Shapiro said, I guess, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah, right.
You know what drives me insane? Do you know what drives me insane? Is like the like incredibly disingenuous React thing where like somebody will watch like Ben Shapiro or Steven Crowder or whoever, pick a name out of a fucking hat, go to their show and watch it, and they just go like, what did he just say? And then like that's it. That's really all the like reaction commentary that you get is just like,
right.
What? Oh, can you believe this? All right, let's move on.
That's horrible. Yeah, that's their whole career.
And then they're millionaires.
Yeah, because like somebody's willing to pay them to just sit there, stare at the camera,
and then every now and then when the United States gets embroiled in a potential foreign policy conflict, as long as they toe that line,
right,
everything will go swimmingly for them in between their video game playing and React Andy segments. Then
right.
Just push the whatever U.S. geopolitical, advocate for lukewarm social democratic reforms within the United States,
right.
But then co-sign
AFC will save us all.
Anything ever that the United States ever wants to do in any third world country is completely justified.
And like, don't get me wrong. All right, look, I started out in like 16 as like a Bernie bro guy, right? And I'm not trying to say that like he didn't serve a purpose, right? But we're at a point like culturally where he's no longer what's the word, like not left enough, but it's just like we have so many other jumping off points and we have such a proliferation, right, of this kind of information and this kind of education.
I also wouldn't condemn anyone for being like, I think it's appropriate to vote for Bernie Sanders. You know what I mean? I understand that logic.
But like, don't try and tell me that like Bernie Sanders, right, is still like the savior and like, the person we need to rally around. Look, I will probably vote for him again, right?
If I was not a convicted felon, I would have.
Yeah, we don't need Pat trying to go to prison. And I'm not going to tell you to vote. I have no hope. I am like almost complete doomer. But I still think that like, getting this kind of information out there and having like the kind of like Twitch stream that like, we're trying to bring, which is like purely based around literature of this kind. Would you get that? Did you get that in Rikers?
No, I get my tattoos professionally, man. When I was getting in trouble, you didn't see any nice tattoos. It was all bullshit.
Imagine if you did get a tattoo of that quality in prison, though. That would be wild. I would like get locked up just to, be able to like pay him in cigarettes.
For ramen noodles and honey buns and stuff.
Fucking. So we're trying to bring you like this thing because I think that like, look, I'm not trying to hate on any other leftist streamer out there. And as far as like I'm concerned, I think that like Rob TRRS Gang is great. Left Flank Vets is great. Famous Horse is amazing. Idan Simpson, is like the best, right?
I'm not part of any Twitch community.
Pat does not give a shit about any of this. He's not even on the Discord, and he doesn't even tweet. Like I'm the one that does all that.
Yeah, shit. I'm not a part of any of those online communities. This is my venture into online leftist advocacy.
If he's on camera, that's him on the stream. Other than that, you're dealing with me. So any of the opinions that you see in chat, that's all me. All right. It's right below the video. Our Discord link should be working. Please let me know if it is or if it isn't.
Our producer, our gracious producer that's been helping us out so much is not present with us tonight. So hopefully in our future streams, we'll be back Wednesday night. I don't have one. This is it. Like, this is all I would say. This is my own. This is my,
Pat, you got to be here on time.
yeah, this is maybe if this progresses more, I might expand a little bit more. But as of right now, because I work full time and I'm in school full time, and I take the stream seriously. Like when I read this book and I research things and I read it and I prepare it, you know what I mean? Like it's not something that I just flippantly do. So from the time that I'm not working and the time that I'm not doing my schoolwork and the time that I'm not, spending time with my girlfriend and the time when I'm not playing Diablo 2 Resurrected to let my brain relax for a moment, I'm reading this book and I'm reading this book and I'm writing things down and I'm trying to put together some type of a coherent thought that I can express to you here so that I don't just look like an idiot.
How the fuck do I do this shit? By the way, I have no idea how to fucking use any of this shit. We still honestly, I'm gonna be honest with you, Sam, we still need to like fill out the Discord, so to speak. It's kind of bare bones right now, so I don't mean to disappoint you. But I'm gonna get you that link right there. So yeah, like I'm bullshitting like all the fucking time. You can follow us on Twitter, you can follow us on here. Tell your friends about it. We would love to be associate. We would love to get like a bigger following because I feel like that would make it a little bit easier for us to get people like Gerald Horn. I honestly wanted to reach out to the dudes in Citations Needed and see if they wanted to come on at some point when we eventually finish inventing reality.
I have some Indian comrades that have agreed to come on that I met during my time in India. Hopefully I can materialize that at some point. I did meet Vijay Prashad and he did say that he would do some things with me. He said he would be down for an interview. But I would probably like to establish ourselves a little more and have kind of like a nice foundation before we bring in the big dogs, our spiritual advisors.
Yeah. Bring in our spiritual uncles. Yeah, no, we would love to do all of this stuff. We just need like a little bit bigger of a following, and like I promise you we're gonna try and stay regular and we're not gonna disappear on you because like we're really dedicated for this. We've invested like a lot of time. Yeah, friend of the stream Vijay Prashad, uncle of the stream Vijay Prashad. We want to keep doing this and we want to expand this too. Like we have like very big plans that we are going to follow through whether we get big or not. Like we plan on going to India, we plan on going to other places and like, either recording while we're there or at least like recording there and like uploading that.
For me personally, I had like a much like grander aspiration to do like highly produced documentary content or like legitimate journalism through some kind of a publication. Now, these things are extremely difficult. Like I've written scripts, I've read books, I've traveled to places, but like just the nature of like video production and editing and everything like that can be extremely difficult. So like just the stream where I can kind of read and come here and talk and be a little bit more off the cuff and we can joke around a little bit and we're not dealing with like extremely overly produced content gives me a little bit more time to do my job, to finish school, everything like that. So like, obviously I would like to realize that dream of producing more journalistic content and or more highly produced documentary content. But the stream is just like an awesome way to kind of begin hashing out topics and talking about things and getting back into the books that everyone should be reading, or at least we should be reading and understanding before we produce some kind of like grander project.
Because I would say that like
this is a little temperature take of like what public opinion is, what the public perception is to some of the topics that we're covering, and if that maybe is conducive to like a larger commitment.
Yeah, because like we thought actually like a lot about the kind of books that we want to cover, and like we're trying to do like very introductory stuff. Like we want to be able to do stuff like The Divide, Inventing Reality. I also think like Caliban and the Witch would be an excellent companion piece to this, because it covers like, you know, the development and the rise and the origins of like the very world that we live in today. Not just capitalism, but also like patriarchy, things like that, and of that nature. How long have you guys been streaming on this channel? Oh yeah, we have only, this is our third episode, right, Pat?
Our fourth stream. The first one was like a intro pilot / like intro, just like an introduction thing that we kind of messed around with. Oh, that's such a good idea, Frankster says. But yeah, like the books that we want to cover, like it's just so hard because it's like these are just what's sitting on my desk right now, and it's like, you know, these are just, in my opinion, like so important.
Frank, that list is gonna be so fucking long.
How Europe underdeveloped. Yeah, we definitely should do that though. I mean, I'd be happy to put one together maybe this weekend. Oh,
same.
Be busy. You know,
I'm probably gonna borrow a lot from Rick from Decolonized Buffalo, honestly, and a lot of those books that like I want to read too. Still, yeah, Pat's library. Basically, the like endless tower of books that somehow never get above camera.
I don't actually own a chair.
Yeah, no, it's what's that tweet, Vlad? Or it's like, you know, it's less of like a library or a book collection and more of an art installation at this point.
Well, I mean, if you're into reading like the way that I am, there is no way that you can read books as quickly as you acquire them. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think I'll ever be at a place where I've read all of my books. I mean, I put a good dent in it. I'd say that it maybe 75%, but like, you know, when you come across those books that you want, you just, you know what I mean? It's like, you know, if you have that like appetite for reading the way that I do, it's impossible to not buy them quicker than you can read them.
I don't even know how he does it. He literally reads like 5 different books at a time. Like,
it's been hard lately in school because like the time that I would spend just sitting down and reading, I have to read textbooks and I have to do essays and things like that. And it's like I pretty much have like, you know, an extensive amount of reading to do, which is cool though, because like this semester I'm in like an art history class and an African history class. So even though it's not maybe the exact book that I want, it's still history related. Even art history has been surprisingly political because like you don't just read about the formal elements of art and like how the styles and everything like that. All art has, especially like the significant arts of history, have a political backdrop that influences the artistic tradition of that time. So I'm learning quite a bit. And like also my reading has, especially being like a socialist such as I am, I've read a lot about Cold War history and World War II history, but my like further back, you know, the medieval time here history, the Dark Ages, the Renaissance, like times like this, I was not very knowledgeable on. And I think art history is like kind of like opening me up to that. And actually I've been learning a lot about like, man, like anti-colonial, like protest art and things like that, like the Romantic era that was producing art that was extremely critical of like French colonies in Senegal and things like that. Things I had no idea about before. It's actually very, very cool to start learning about that. You know, art that surrounded the French Revolution, things like that. So art's pretty cool, man.
I'm trying to find the quote of this guy, right, from the Soviet Union. That stated, "And therefore I raise my glass to you, writers, the engineers of the human soul." That was speech by this guy. Speech at home of Maxim Gorky. It was taken up by Andrei Zhdanov and developed into the idea of socialist realism. Maybe we'll cover that guy one day.
What covered first, socialist realism or capitalist realism by the Mark Fisher book?
Oh, it's socialist realism definitely came first. Capitalist realism is the book by Mark Fisher, the late Mark Fisher.
I've never read it.
You've never read it?
No. I know it's like very highly regarded though. I just haven't read that one.
It's pretty good. I've read it. Hey, thank you, CFCW6RST. So like, you know, it's pretty neat. It's more like postmodern kind of, which like I'm not really that big a fan of. I'm a materialist, but like,
well, you could even consider Gramsci a postmodernist though, and I think we all appreciate Gramscian thought.
Yeah, I appreciate Gramsci. I think that Gramsci at times, like, at least, from that book that you gave me, in terms of like philosophy wise, I think he hits a little bit harder than Lenin sometimes. That's just me.
He was inspired by Lenin. State and Revolution was a extremely influential book to Gramsci.
I don't know if I would call Gramsci a postmodernist.
That's a descriptive term that I've heard.
Because I think that like a lot of postmodernism, because and this we're heading into like way in the weeds territory. Like I think that like a lot of postmodernists will cling on to anybody that they could, reasonably disassociate from the Soviet Union or from actually existing socialism, if you know what I mean. It's kind of like how a lot of them gravitate towards like, Rosa Luxemburg, they gravitate towards Lukács, they gravitate towards like anybody that either turned away from actually existing socialism, right, or was before it, you know what I mean? But whatever. That's a whole other topic. We'll talk about Gabriel Rockhill another time. All right, so everybody, we're gonna stream again. Let me see here. We will stream again on Sunday, November 20th. Hopefully we can arm you with some of the best quick little one-liners and quips that you can throw at your uncle, especially now that Trump announced that he's running again in 2024. Right, or just like deeply upset everybody at the Thanksgiving table. I
think that what was influencing me to say that was that there's a book by Gramsci called Beyond Marxism and Postmodernism. Right. So that might be another link if you are interested in looking more. I just posted the link in chat if you're interested in looking more into that connection.
Yeah, Lisa Frank is lit.
Shit's lit.
Also interested. Other than that, I'm curious what links there might be. Yeah, I promise you, we're gonna fill all this stuff out. Pat's really busy, with work. I'm constantly bullshitting, and I'm a procrastinator, and I don't manage my time right. And I should probably be working more than I have been, and should probably spend more time with my wife. So,
my wife.
Sometimes things be what they do, and we'll try and get more to you. So yeah, I think like we're gonna call it for the night. I don't even think that we can raid, right? I don't think, because we're not even like an affiliate yet or anything. I don't think we can do that. I don't see that anywhere here. I don't fucking know. Our producer isn't here tonight. See you guys all on the 20th. Lal Salam.
Lal Salam.
Stay strong.
All right. Have a good day. Have a good night, everybody.
Have a good night, everybody.